The sun was very hot in the port of San Porto. The air smelled like salt and old wood. Captain Julian walked through the busy market. He was a tall man with a dark beard and tired eyes. He spent many years on the sea, and his skin was brown from the sun. He wore a long blue coat and a hat. At his side, he carried a heavy sword. Julian looked at the different tables in the market. People sold fruit, fish, and colorful clothes. He was not looking for food. He was looking for something special. He wanted an adventure. He was tired of carrying simple cargo from one island to another. He wanted to find something that no one else had. He stopped at a small, dusty table at the end of the street. An old traveler sat behind it. The traveler had a long grey beard and wore a dirty brown cloak. He looked very old and very wise. On the table, there were many strange objects. There were old keys, silver rings, and pieces of green glass. "Are you looking for something, Captain?" the traveler asked. His voice was low and slow. Julian looked at the objects. "I am looking for a reason to sail." Julian said, "I want a new path." The traveler smiled. He reached into a small leather bag and pulled out a metal object. It was a compass made of dark bronze. It looked very old. There were strange symbols on the side of the metal. The glass on top was cracked. Julian picked it up. He looked at the needle inside. The needle did not move toward the north. It pointed in a different direction. "It is broken," Julian said. He shook the compass, but the needle stayed in the same place. "It is not broken," the traveler replied. "It does not point to the north. It points to the island of the sun. Many people think the island is just a story, but the compass knows the way." Julian felt a spark of excitement. He heard stories about the island of the sun when he was a young sailor. People said the island had a temple full of gold. They said the sun always shone there, even at night. "How much do you want for it?" Julian asked. 10 gold coins," the traveler said. Julian reached into his pocket. 10 gold coins was a lot of money, but he did not care. He put the heavy gold coins on the table. The traveler took the coins and hid them in his cloak. "Be careful, Captain," the traveler warned. "The island of the sun is a dangerous place. Many men go there, but few men come back." Julian put the compass in his pocket. He felt the heavy weight of the bronze against his leg. He did not feel afraid. He felt alive. He turned away from the table and walked toward the docks. He needed to find his crew. He needed to find his friend, Maria. The adventure was finally starting. The tavern was called the Salty Dog. It was a loud and dark place near the docks. The air inside was thick with the smell of old tobacco and cooked fish. Julian pushed open the heavy wooden door. A loud noise of many voices and laughter filled the room. He looked around the crowded tables. He saw many sailors, travelers, and traders. They were all adults with rough hands and sunburned faces. In the corner, Julian saw a woman with long red hair tied back in a tight knot. This was Maria. She was a very experienced sailor and a brave leader. She wore a brown leather vest and heavy boots. She was famous in San Porto because she was very good at reading the stars. She sat alone at a small table. She had a large cup of water and a piece of bread in front of her. Julian walked over to her and sat down. "Julian," Maria said with a small smile, "you look like you have a secret." "I do," Julian replied. He looked around to make sure no one was listening. He leaned forward and placed the bronze compass on the table. Maria looked at it closely. She touched the cracked glass with her finger. "A broken compass? Is this your secret?" she asked. She laughed a little, but her eyes were curious. "It is not broken," Julian said. He spoke in a very low voice. "Watch the needle. It does not move when I turn the compass. It always points in one direction. A traveler in the market told me it points to the island of the sun." Maria stopped laughing. She looked at the needle again. She moved the compass to the left and then to the right. The needle did not move. It pointed toward the open sea. The island of the sun. "People say that place is a myth, Julian. They say the gold there is protected by ancient magic." "I do not care about magic," Julian said. "I want to see it. I want to find the temple. But I cannot do it alone. I need a first mate. I need someone I can trust to help me lead the sailors." Maria looked at the compass for a long time. She thought about the long days at sea and the dangerous storms. She thought about the empty pockets of the crew. Then, she looked Julian in the eyes. "The Admiral is looking for new treasures, Julian. If he hears about this, he will follow us with his big ships. It will be a very dangerous trip." "I know," Julian said. "But we have a fast ship. We can leave before the Admiral knows our plan. We can be far away by sunrise." Maria took a slow drink of her water. She stood up and held out her hand. "Okay, Julian. I am in. Let's find this island. Let's go to the docks and see the crew. We have a lot of work to do tonight." Julian shook her hand. He felt a wave of relief. With Maria at his side, he felt much more confident. They walked out of the tavern together. Outside, the sound of the waves hitting the harbor walls was like a steady drum. The night was cool, and the adventure was truly beginning. The docks were quiet at night, but Julian and Maria walked with purpose. At the end of the wooden pier, a large ship floated on the dark water. This was the Star of the Sea. It was a beautiful vessel with 3 tall masts and a strong wooden hull. The ship was fast, but it was also built for a fight. Julian spent all his gold over the years to keep this ship in perfect condition. "She looks ready," Maria said. She looked up at the long ropes and the folded white sails. "She is the best ship in this port," Julian replied. He felt proud when he looked at the Star of the Sea. They walked up the wooden ramp and onto the main deck. A group of men and women worked under the light of small lanterns. These were the sailors. They were all adults with many years of experience. They knew how to handle a ship in a storm and how to use a sword in a battle. A large man with a thick grey beard walked toward them. This was Silas, the boatswain. He was responsible for the ship's equipment. He held a long list in his rough hands. "Captain, we are almost ready," Silas said. His voice was deep and steady. "We have enough fresh water for 2 months. We have dried meat, flour, and many bags of fruit. The crew is loading the last of the gunpowder now." Julian nodded. "Good work, Silas. What about the cannons?" Silas pointed to the sides of the ship. There were 12 heavy cannons, 6 on each side. They were made of black iron and looked very strong. "The cannons are clean and ready. We have plenty of iron balls. If the Admiral follows us, we can defend ourselves." The crew continued to work. Some sailors pulled heavy ropes. Others carried heavy barrels down into the dark storage rooms below the deck. There were no children here. Everyone was a professional who knew the dangers of the ocean. Maria went to the back of the ship to check the steering wheel. She also looked at the stars to plan their direction. Julian walked to the front of the ship. He pulled the bronze compass from his pocket. The needle still pointed away from the land, toward the empty horizon. The air was getting colder. The smell of the salty ocean was very strong now. Julian could hear the water hitting the side of the ship with a constant, soft splashing. It was a peaceful sound, but Julian knew the sea could become angry very quickly. "Tell the crew to rest for a few hours," Julian told Silas. We leave before the sun comes up. I want every sail open and every sailor at their post." Silas nodded and went to talk to the sailors. Julian stood on the deck and looked at the dark sky. The Star of the Sea was ready. The crew was ready. Tomorrow, they would sail into the unknown. The sun was not up yet. The sky was a dark purple color. High above the harbor, in a large stone building, a man stood by a window. This was Admiral Vance. He was a powerful man with a very clean white uniform and bright gold buttons. He looked out at the ships in the harbor. He was the most important leader in the port. He had many soldiers and many large ships with heavy cannons. An officer entered the room and stood at the door. He looked nervous. He held his hat in his hands. "Admiral," the officer said, "we have news from the market. One of our men was listening to the travelers." The admiral turned around slowly. His face was hard and his eyes were cold. He did not like to wait for information. "Tell me what you heard," he said in a low voice. "A traveler sold a special compass to Captain Julian." The officer explained. The traveler told Julian that it is not a normal compass. He said it points to the island of the sun. Julian paid 10 gold coins for it. The admiral's eyes became narrow. He knew the old stories about the Golden Temple. He wanted that gold for himself. He wanted the king to be proud of him, and he wanted to be the richest man in the ocean. He did not want a common pirate like Julian to find the treasure first. Captain Julian is a clever sailor, the admiral said. But he is only a pirate. We are the navy. We have the best ships and the best maps. The admiral walked to his large wooden desk. There was a big map of the ocean on the desk. He placed his hand on the paper. He looked at the empty space where the island of the sun was usually hidden in the stories. "Give the order to the men," the admiral said. "Prepare the iron whale. I want our best sailors on the deck immediately. We will follow Julian. We will stay far behind him so he does not see us. We will let him find the island first. Then, we will take the compass and the gold from his hands." "But, Admiral," the officer said, "the sea is very dangerous in that direction. There are many storms and sharp rocks under the water." "I do not care about the dangers," the admiral replied. "I want that gold. If Julian leaves tonight, we leave tonight. Tell the soldiers to prepare their rifles and their swords. No one must sleep until we are at sea." The officer bowed and left the room quickly. The admiral looked back at the harbor. He saw the Star of the Sea at the docks. He saw the small yellow lights of the lanterns on the ship. He smiled, but it was a cold and hungry smile. "Go ahead, Julian," the admiral whispered to the dark window. "Show me the way. I will be right behind you in the shadows." In the harbor, the admiral's soldiers began to move. They carried heavy boxes of supplies and many weapons. The Iron Whale was a giant ship of dark wood and iron. It was ready for war. The admiral was ready to start his hunt. The morning sun began to rise. The sky changed from dark purple to a bright, clear blue. The Star of the Sea was now far from the port of San Porto. The land was only a small, thin line behind them. Soon, that line disappeared completely. Now, there was only the blue water and the blue sky in every direction. Captain Julian stood on the deck. He felt the ship move under his boots. It was a smooth, steady movement. The wind was strong and filled the large white sails. The ship felt alive and fast. Julian liked this feeling. On the open ocean, he felt free from the rules of the city. "The wind is perfect, Captain," Maria said. She walked up the stairs to the quarterdeck. She was holding a heavy rope to stay steady. Her red hair moved in the breeze. She looked at the horizon with a serious expression. "Yes," Julian agreed. At this speed, we will be in deep water by noon. He pulled the bronze compass from his pocket. The needle was steady. It pointed directly toward the empty ocean ahead of them. Julian looked at the cracked glass. He wondered what they would find at the end of this needle. He knew the stories, but stories and reality were often very different. On the main deck, the sailors were busy. Silas, the boatswain, gave instructions to the men and women. They were all hard workers. Some sailors climbed the tall masts to check the ropes and the sails. Others cleaned the wooden floor of the deck with heavy brushes and buckets of water. There was a constant, rhythmic sound of the wind pushing the sails and the water hitting the side of the ship. Julian listened to these noises. It was a good sound. It meant the ship was healthy and strong. "How is the crew?" Julian asked Maria. "They are focused." Maria replied. "They know this is not a normal trip. They talk about the gold, but they also look at the sea. They know the deep water can be dangerous. They are adults who have seen many things." "Good," Julian said. "We need them to be ready. The admiral is out there somewhere. He is not a man who gives up easily. He has a big ship and many soldiers." Julian went to the back of the ship. He looked at the white path the ship left in the water. It was a long, straight line. They were moving away from everything they knew. Ahead of them, there were no maps for this part of the sea. They only had the bronze compass and the stars to guide them. As the day continued, the sun became very bright. The water changed from light blue to a very dark, deep blue. Large fish sometimes jumped out of the water near the ship. The sailors watched them and smiled. It was a beautiful day, but Julian knew that the ocean could change its mood in a moment. For now, they were moving closer to the island of the sun with every passing hour. The afternoon brought a sudden change to the weather. The bright blue sky turned a heavy, dark grey. The wind, which was a soft breeze before, became cold and very strong. Julian looked at the horizon. A wall of black clouds moved toward them quickly. The ocean began to change, too. The small waves became tall, white-capped mountains of water. "A storm is coming," Julian shouted. His voice was loud and clear. "Silas, get the men to the masts. We must lower the sails immediately." The sailors moved fast. They were experienced and knew the danger of a storm in deep water. They climbed the tall wooden masts while the ship moved violently from side to side. They pulled the heavy ropes to fold the white sails. The wind pushed against the fabric, making a loud snapping sound as the sailors worked to secure it. Suddenly, the first drops of rain fell. They were large and cold. Soon, the rain was a heavy curtain that made it difficult to see. The wind started to make a high, whistling sound through the ship's ropes. The Star of the Sea began to climb the high waves and then drop down into the deep valleys of water. Maria grabbed the large wooden steering wheel. She used all her strength to keep the ship straight. A massive wall of water crashed onto the deck. The water moved across the wood with great force, but the sailors held onto the ropes and the sides of the ship. No one fell into the dark ocean. "Hold the wheel, Maria," Julian cried. He walked across the slippery deck to help her. Together, they pushed the wheel against the power of the waves. The wood of the ship made a deep, groaning sound as it fought the ocean. Inside the ship, the heavy barrels and boxes moved around. The sound of objects hitting the walls echoed from below. But the ship was strong. Julian had built it to survive these moments. He looked at the compass in his hand. Even in the middle of the storm, the needle was steady. It pointed into the heart of the wind. The storm lasted for hours. The crew was tired and wet, but no one stopped working. They used buckets to throw water back into the sea. They checked the ropes again and again. Every sailor was an adult who understood that their lives depended on their hard work. Finally, the wind began to slow down. The heavy rain became a light mist. The black clouds moved away, and a small piece of the moon appeared in the sky. The ocean was still rough, but the mountain-sized waves were gone. Julian sat down on a wooden bench. He was exhausted. His clothes were heavy with water. He looked at Maria. She was tired, too, but she smiled at him. They were safe. The Star of the Sea survived its first great test. We made it, Maria said softly. Her voice was a little shaky, but her eyes were bright. Julian looked at the dark water. The storm was over, but the journey was still long. He knew they needed to rest before the sun comes up again. The morning sun was warm and bright. The sky was clear again, and the ocean was a peaceful, light blue. The Star of the Sea moved slowly across the water. The crew was busy on the deck. They needed to fix the damage from the big storm. Some sailors used hammers to repair the wooden railings. Others used needles and thick thread to fix small holes in the sails. Everyone worked hard, but they were very tired. Julian stood on the quarterdeck with Maria. He looked at the horizon through his brass telescope. Everything looked empty and silent. Suddenly, a sailor named Leo shouted from the front of the ship. He was pointing his hand toward the sky. "Look! Over there!" Leo cried. Julian and Maria looked up. High above the masts, a large bird was flying. It was a beautiful bird with very long, white wings. The tips of its feathers were a bright, golden color. The bird circled the ship 3 times. It made a sharp, clear cry that echoed across the quiet water. Then, it began to fly away toward the west. "I know that bird," Maria said. Her voice was full of wonder. "That is a suncatcher. My father told me stories about them. They are very rare. People say they only live in one place in the whole world. They live on the island of the sun." Julian felt a surge of energy. He forgot about his tired muscles. He pulled the bronze compass from his pocket. He looked at the needle. The needle was pointing exactly in the same direction as the bird. "The bird is showing us the way," Julian said. He looked at the sailors on the deck. "Did you hear that? The island of the sun is near. We are on the right path." The sailors stopped their work. A few of them began to cheer. The feeling of tiredness disappeared. They felt new hope. Silas, the bosun, began to give orders with a big smile on his face. He told the sailors to pull the ropes tighter. He wanted the ship to move faster to follow the bird. "The bird is a good sign," Silas said to Julian. "But we must be careful. These birds like to fly over the reefs. There are many sharp rocks in this part of the sea." Julian nodded. He knew the danger was not over. He looked at the white bird again. It was now a small dot against the blue sky. The bird was fast, but the Star of the Sea was fast too. "Maria, stay at the wheel," Julian ordered. "I want you to follow that bird exactly. Do not let it out of your sight. We are going to find that island before the sun goes down again." The ship moved forward with a new spirit. The sound of the water against the hull was like a happy song. The crew felt like heroes. They were not just pirates now. They were explorers. The island of the sun was no longer a story. It was real, and it was waiting for them just beyond the horizon. The mood on the ship changed quickly. The water around the Star of the Sea was no longer a deep, dark blue. It became a light, pale green. This meant the water was shallow. Julian looked over the side of the ship. He saw dark, jagged shapes under the surface of the water. These were not fish. They were sharp rocks. "Slow down," Julian shouted. "Fold the top sails. We must move with caution." The sailors worked quickly but quietly. They felt the tension in the air. Silas stood at the very front of the ship. He held a long wooden pole. He pushed the pole into the water to check the depth. He looked at the waves breaking against the hidden stones. Rocks to the right. Silas cried out. "Very close, Captain." Julian looked ahead. This area was known among old sailors as the Reef of Bones. It was a graveyard for ships. He could see why. In the distance, the broken remains of an old merchant ship stuck out of the water. Its wooden ribs looked like the bones of a giant animal. The white salt from the sea covered the old wood. There were no people there, only the silence of the ocean and the white foam of the waves. Maria held the steering wheel with both hands. Her face was very serious. She didn't look at Julian. She only looked at the water and listened to Silas. The ship moved slowly, turning left and then right. The star of the sea was like a dancer moving between the sharp edges of the rocks. Suddenly, a loud, scraping sound came from the bottom of the ship. It was the sound of wood hitting stone. The whole ship shook for a moment. The sailors held onto the ropes. Julian felt his heart beat faster. He ran to the side and looked down. "Did we hit it hard?" Julian asked. Silas looked down into the clear green water. He waited for a few seconds. "It was only a light touch, Captain. The hull is strong. We are not taking in water. But we must be even more careful now. The path is getting narrower." For 2 hours, no one spoke. The only sounds were the wind in the ropes and the gentle splashing of the water against the rocks. The sun was high in the sky, making it easier to see the rocks under the surface, but the glare of the light on the water was painful for the eyes. Finally, the color of the water began to change again. The pale green turned back into a rich, dark blue. The sharp rocks disappeared. The star of the sea reached deep water once more. The crew let out a collective breath of relief. Some sailors sat down on the deck and wiped the sweat from their foreheads. "We are through," Maria said. She let go of the wheel for a moment to stretch her tired arms. That was the most dangerous part of the map. Julian looked back at the Reef of Bones. He thought about the sailors who did not make it through. He felt lucky, but he also knew that their journey was only beginning. The compass in his pocket felt warm. They were closer now. He could feel it in the air. The next morning, a thick white mist covered the ocean. It was very quiet. The star of the sea moved slowly through the fog. The sailors could not see the sun or the horizon. Julian stood at the front of the ship. He kept his hand on the hilt of his sword. He felt nervous but also very curious. He pulled out the bronze compass. The needle was vibrating. It was pointing straight ahead into the white cloud. "Can you see anything, Maria?" Julian asked. Maria stood near him. She shook her head. "No, Captain. The air is too thick. But I can smell the land. It smells like wet earth and flowers. We are very close." Suddenly, the wind began to blow. It was a warm, gentle wind. It pushed the mist away slowly, like a curtain opening in a theater. The sun started to shine through the clouds. Then, everyone on the ship stopped what they were doing. In the distance, a giant mountain rose out of the blue water. It was a beautiful sight. The mountain was covered in thick, green forests. At the very top, there was a high peak that looked like it was made of white stone. The sunlight hit the peak, and it sparkled like a diamond. "Land ho!" A sailor shouted from the high mast. The crew ran to the side of the ship. They looked at the island with wide eyes. It was not a small island. It was large and magnificent. They saw long beaches with sand that looked like bright gold. There were no other ships in the bay. The island looked peaceful and untouched by time. "Is that it?" Silas asked. He walked up to Julian and Maria. He looked at the mountain with wonder. "Is that the island of the sun?" Julian looked at his compass one last time. The needle was perfectly still now. It pointed exactly at the center of the mountain. "Yes," Julian said. His voice was full of emotion. "That is the place. We found it." The ship moved closer to the shore. As they approached, they could see more details. They saw giant trees with large, colorful leaves. They saw bright birds flying over the trees. The water in the bay was so clear that they could see the white sand at the bottom. There were no signs of houses or people. "Look at the peak," Maria whispered. "It is so high. The temple must be up there." Julian felt a sense of great achievement. Many people told him he was crazy to look for this place. They told him it was just a story for children. But he was an adult who believed in his dreams, and now his dream was right in front of him. "Prepare the small boats." Julian ordered his crew. "We cannot take the big ship too close to the beach. We will go to the shore in groups. Silas, stay with the ship and keep the cannons ready. Maria and 4 sailors will come with me." The sailors moved quickly. They felt a new energy. The journey across the deep ocean was over. Now, the adventure on the island was ready to begin. The Star of the Sea moved slowly into the quiet bay. The water here was as calm as a mirror. Julian could see the shadows of large fish swimming deep under the ship. The wind was soft now, and the giant white sails hung loose from the masts. The ship stopped moving when it reached the center of the bay. "Drop the anchor," Julian shouted. Silas and 2 other sailors worked together. They pushed a heavy metal lever. The thick iron chain moved quickly down the side of the ship. The heavy anchor hit the surface of the water and sank deep into the sand at the bottom. The ship stayed in one place. It felt stable and safe in the protected harbor. Julian looked at the beach. The sand was very bright, almost like real gold. Behind the sand, the green trees were thick and tall. He could hear the distant cries of tropical birds, but he did not see any people. The island was silent and mysterious. "The water is shallow enough for the small boats," Maria said. She stood next to Julian, checking her belt. She had a small bag of supplies and her sharp sword. "We should go now while the sun is high in the sky." Julian turned to the crew. All the sailors were standing on the deck. They were waiting for his command. They looked excited, but also a little bit afraid. They knew the stories about the island's traps. "Listen to me," Julian called out. "We are here. This is the island of the sun. But we must be smart. Silas, you are in charge of the ship. Keep the cannons ready. If you see another ship, or if we send a signal, be ready to move. Maria, Leo, and 2 others will come with me to the shore." The sailors moved to the side of the ship. They used ropes to lower 2 small wooden boats into the water. The boats moved gently on the small waves. Julian climbed down a rope ladder and stepped into the first boat. Maria followed him. They sat on the wooden benches and took the heavy oars. "Row together," Julian said. The sailors pushed the oars into the clear water. They moved away from the Star of the Sea. Julian looked back at his ship. It looked small against the giant green mountain of the island. He felt a moment of worry, but he pushed it away. He had the compass in his pocket and his friends at his side. As the boats got closer to the shore, the sound of the small waves hitting the sand became louder. The water was so clear that Julian could see colorful shells on the ocean floor. The boats finally reached the beach. The wood of the boats made a soft scraping sound against the sand. Julian was the first person to step out. His boots sank into the warm, golden sand. He looked at the thick jungle in front of them. "We are here," he whispered. The adventure on land was finally beginning. Captain Julian stood on the beach. The sand was very bright and yellow. It looked like tiny pieces of gold under the hot sun. He felt the heat on his face and the warmth of the ground through his boots. Maria stepped out of the boat next to him. She looked down at the ground with a look of surprise. "Is it real gold?" Leo asked. He was a strong sailor with big muscles and a friendly face. He was an adult who spent many years on ships. He bent down and touched the sand with his rough hand. He let the grains fall through his fingers. "No," Julian said. He shook his head slowly. "It is just very beautiful sand. But it is a good sign. The stories say the sand here is the color of the sun. It means we are in the right place." The sailors worked together to pull the small boats high onto the beach. They did not want the tide to come in and take the boats back to the ocean. The water was very clear and blue. They could see their own shadows on the bottom of the sea. The bay was peaceful, but Julian did not feel completely relaxed. Everything was very quiet. There was no wind in the trees. The only sound was the water hitting the shore. It was a gentle, rhythmic sound that repeated over and over. Julian looked at the thick green forest. The trees were like a giant wall of leaves. He could not see any paths or tracks. It looked like no one walked on this beach for 100 years. "We must be careful," Maria whispered. She checked the belt of her sword to make sure it was ready. "This place is too quiet. I do not see any large animals. I do not see any movement in the trees. It feels like the island is waiting for us." Julian pulled the bronze compass from his pocket. The needle was not moving at all. It pointed straight into the middle of the jungle, toward the high mountain. "The path is this way," Julian said. He pointed toward a large tree with bright purple flowers. "The temple is behind those trees. We must stay together. No one goes alone into the forest." The crew checked their supplies one last time. They had small bags of food, bottles of fresh water, and their weapons. They were all experienced adults who knew that a beautiful place could also hide many dangers. They stood in a line behind Julian and Maria. Julian took a deep breath. The air was heavy and smelled like tropical fruit and wet earth. He felt the weight of his sword at his side. He looked at Maria, and she nodded at him. She was ready for whatever was inside the jungle. "Let's move," Julian said. They walked away from the ocean. Their boots made a soft, crunching noise in the dry sand. When they reached the edge of the forest, the temperature changed. It was suddenly cool and dark under the giant trees. The sunlight could not reach the ground easily here. Julian looked back at the Star of the Sea one last time. The ship looked very far away and very small. Then, he stepped into the green shadows of the trees. The jungle was much thicker than it looked from the beach. The trees were giant and very old. Their roots were as thick as the bodies of the sailors. Long green vines hung from the branches like heavy ropes. The sunlight was very dim because the leaves above were so large and dense. It was like walking in a green room with very little light. "It is very hard to move here," Leo said. He wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. He took out his heavy sword. He used the sharp metal to cut through a wall of large, flat leaves. The sound of the sword hitting the plants was steady and rhythmic. Julian followed close behind Leo. He also used his sword to clear the path. The plants were wet, and the air was very humid. Every time they cut a vine, a sweet and heavy smell filled the air. Julian looked down at the bronze compass frequently. The needle stayed fixed in one direction. It did not matter how many times they turned or moved around a large tree. The compass knew the way. "Keep your eyes open," Maria warned. She walked in the middle of the group. She did not use a sword because she was watching the ground and the trees. In a place like this, it is easy to lose the way. We must stay close to each other. They walked for a long time. The ground was covered in soft moss and dead leaves. Sometimes, their boots sank deep into the mud. They heard the sound of unseen animals moving in the high branches. There were loud cries from birds, but the birds stayed hidden in the green canopy. The sailors were adults who knew that a quiet predator could be watching from the shadows, so they kept their hands on their weapons. After an hour of hard work, they reached a small opening in the trees. In the center of the opening, Julian saw something strange. It was a long, flat stone on the ground. It was covered in green moss and dirt. Julian knelt down and used his hand to clean the stone. "Look at this," Julian said to Maria. Under the dirt, the stone was smooth and grey. It was not a natural rock. It was a paving stone. Maria knelt next to him and touched the surface. "This is a road," she whispered. "A very old road. The jungle grew over it, but the stones are still here." Julian felt a new wave of excitement. This meant they were on the right track. The people who built the temple also built this road. He looked ahead. He could see more stones hidden under the vines and the mud. The path was leading them directly toward the base of the high mountain. "We follow the stones now," Julian said. He stood up and looked at his tired sailors. "We are not just walking through the woods anymore. We are walking on a path made by the ancients. We are getting closer." The crew felt more confident now. They started to move faster. Leo continued to cut the vines, but now he had a clear direction. The sound of their boots on the hidden stones was a solid, comforting noise. They were moving deeper into the heart of the island, following a road that no human had used for hundreds of years. The stone road made the walking easier, but Julian did not let his guard down. The jungle was still very thick on both sides of the path. The air was heavy and still. Every step they took felt important. They were now at the base of the mountain, and the trees here were even taller. Leo was still in front. He used his sword to clear away small branches. He was looking at a bright blue butterfly near a large bush. He took a step forward, ready to clear the next section of the path. "Wait!" Maria suddenly shouted. Her voice was sharp and loud. Leo stopped with one foot in the air. He looked back at Maria with a confused expression. "What is it?" he asked. Maria walked forward slowly. She pointed at the ground in front of Leo's foot. At first, it looked like a normal pile of brown leaves and small sticks. But when Julian looked closer, he saw that the leaves were too flat and the sticks were too straight. Julian took a long branch from the ground. He reached out and pushed the center of the pile of leaves. Immediately, the ground seemed to disappear. The sticks broke, and the leaves fell into a dark hole. A dry, snapping sound of breaking would fill the air. The sailors gasped. In front of Leo was a deep pit. It was about 3 meters deep. At the bottom of the pit, there were sharp wooden stakes pointing upward. If Leo had taken one more step, he would have fallen onto those spikes. "It is a trap," Julian whispered. He felt a cold shiver on his back. "A very old trap, but it still works." Leo stepped back away from the hole. His face was pale. "Thank you, Maria," he said. His voice was a little shaky. "I was looking at the butterfly. I did not see the ground." "The ancients did not want visitors," Maria said. She knelt at the edge of the pit and looked at the spikes. "These stakes are made of a very hard wood. They are still sharp after all these years. This means the temple is very important to the people who lived here. They protected the path." Julian looked at the jungle around them. Now, the forest did not look beautiful. It looked dangerous. He realized that every shadow could hide a hole or a falling log. They were not just fighting the heat and the plants. They were walking into a defense system. "From now on, we move very slowly," Julian ordered. "Sam, take the other side. Use a pole to hit the ground before every step. If the ground feels soft or hollow, stop immediately." The crew changed their formation. They walked in a single line. A sailor named Sam used a long piece of wood to tap the stone road. Each time the wood hit the solid stone, it made a dull thud. They moved like snails, checking every inch of the path. The sun was beginning to move lower in the sky. The shadows of the trees grew long and thin. Julian knew they needed to find a safe place to sleep soon, but they could not stop in the middle of a trapped road. They had to be more careful than ever before. The crew moved past the dangerous pit with great care. The jungle began to change as they climbed higher. The ground was no longer soft mud and moss. It was now made of hard, grey rock. The trees were smaller here, but their branches were twisted and sharp. The air felt a little cooler, but the sun was still bright above the mountain peak. Suddenly, the path opened into a wide area. On both sides of the stone road, giant shapes rose from the ground. The sailors stopped and looked up in silence. They were standing in front of 2 rows of massive stone statues. Each statue was a giant face carved into a single piece of dark rock. The faces were twice as tall as Julian. They had large, square jaws and long, flat noses. Their eyes were wide and blank, staring straight ahead at the path. Some of the statues were covered in green vines, and others had cracks from the weather, but they still looked very powerful. They look like they are alive. Leo whispered. He moved closer to one of the statues but did not touch it. It feels like they are watching us. Julian walked to the center of the road. He looked at the long line of faces. There were 10 statues on the left and 10 on the right. They formed a silent guard for the road to the mountain. The expressions on the faces were not angry, but they were very serious. It was a warning to any person who wanted to find the treasure. These are the guardians of the sun, Maria said. She reached out and wiped some dust from the base of a statue. In the old stories, people said these statues were built to protect the temple from greedy men. They are symbols of the sun's power. Do they move? Sam asked. He looked at the heavy stone arms of the statues. He was a brave sailor, but these giant faces made him feel very small. No, they are just stone, Julian replied. He tried to sound confident, but the people who made them were very skilled. They wanted to make us feel afraid. They wanted us to turn back and go to our ship. Julian looked at his crew. The sailors were looking at the statues with a mix of fear and wonder. He knew he had to keep them moving. If they stayed here too long, the silence and the staring eyes would break their spirit. We are not turning back, Julian said loudly. His voice echoed against the rock walls. We are explorers. These statues are just markers on our map. We will pass through the middle, and we will continue to the mountain. Julian led the way. He walked between the 2 rows of giant faces. The sound of his boots on the stone road was the only noise in the quiet air. One by one, the sailors followed him. They walked quickly, looking up at the blank stone eyes. It felt like the statues were turning their heads to follow the pirates, but it was only a trick of the light and the shadows. When they reached the end of the line of statues, the path became steep again. Julian looked back. The 20 stone faces stood silent in the sun. They were behind them now, but Julian could still feel their heavy gaze on his back. They were deeper into the island's heart now, and the mysteries were growing. The sun began to go down behind the high mountain. The sky changed from a bright blue to a beautiful orange and pink color. The long shadows of the trees stretched across the stone road. Julian looked for a safe place to stop. The crew was very tired. Their legs were heavy from the long walk and the steep climb. He found a small, flat area near a group of large rocks. We will stay here for the night, Julian said. The sailors let out a long breath of relief. They put down their heavy bags and sat on the ground. Leo and Sam went to find dry wood for a fire. They returned with a large pile of sticks and branches. Soon, they started a small fire in the center of the camp. The orange flames moved in the light wind. The heat felt very good on their tired bodies. Maria opened a leather bag. She gave everyone a piece of dried meat and some hard bread. It was a simple meal, but they were all very hungry. They ate in silence for a few minutes, watching the fire. The dry wood made small popping sounds in the heat. The light of the fire made the surrounding trees look like tall, dark giants. "What will you do with your gold, Leo?" Sam asked. He was looking at the glowing coals of the fire. Leo smiled. He was a big man with a kind face. "I want to buy a small farm near the sea. I want to grow oranges and lemons. I am tired of the salty water and the cold wind. I want a quiet life with a soft bed." Sam nodded. "I want to go back to the city. I want to wear a fine silk coat and eat in the best restaurants. I want everyone to know my name." Maria looked at the fire. She did not talk about houses or clothes. "I just want to see the temple," she said softly. "I want to know if the stories are true. I want to see the stars from the top of the mountain." Julian listened to his friends. He felt a heavy responsibility. These people trusted him. They were all adults who chose to follow him into danger. He thought about the admiral. He wondered if the iron whale was already in the bay. He looked up at the stars. They were very bright and looked like tiny diamonds in the black sky. "We must keep a watch," Julian ordered. "The admiral is behind us, and this island is full of traps. Leo, you take the first watch. Sam, you take the second. I will wake up before the sun." The sailors prepared their beds. They used their coats as blankets. One by one, they fell asleep. The jungle was full of night sounds. The wind moved through the leaves with a soft whispering sound. Julian stayed awake for a little longer. He held the bronze compass in his hand. He felt the cold metal against his palm. Tomorrow, they would reach the secret waterfall. He closed his eyes and dreamed of golden light. The first light of the sun touched Julian's face. He woke up before the others. The air was very cold and thin because they were high on the mountain. The fire from the night was now just a pile of grey ash. Julian stood up and stretched his tired arms. He felt a strange feeling in his stomach. It was the feeling of being watched. He walked away from the sleeping crew. He climbed a large, flat rock that looked over the path they traveled the day before. From this high place, he could see all the way down to the blue bay. The morning mist was moving away from the water. Julian's heart sank. In the middle of the quiet bay, there was a second ship. It was much larger than the Star of the Sea. It had dark wooden sides and many rows of black cannons. A flag with a red crown moved in the wind. "The Iron Whale," Julian whispered to himself. "The Admiral found them." Julian watched through his telescope. He saw small boats moving from the big ship to the golden beach. The boats were full of soldiers in bright white uniforms. Their metal helmets sparkled in the morning sun. They carried long rifles and heavy packs. The Admiral was not wasting any time. He was already sending his men into the jungle. Julian ran back to the camp. He did not make a loud noise, but his face was very serious. He touched Maria's shoulder to wake her. She opened her eyes and was immediately alert. She saw the look on Julian's face and sat up quickly. "He is here, isn't he?" she asked. "Yes," Julian replied. "The Admiral is in the bay. His soldiers are on the beach right now. They will find the stone road soon. They have more men and more weapons than us." Maria stood up and began to wake the other sailors. "We must go now. We cannot wait for breakfast. If they find our tracks, they will catch us before we reach the summit." Leo and Sam woke up quickly. They heard the news and felt a wave of fear. They were brave adults, but they knew the power of the Admiral's navy. They packed their blankets and bags in silence. They moved with speed and precision. How far behind are they? Leo asked. He was checking the sharp edge of his sword. Maybe 3 hours, Julian estimated. But they are soldiers. They march fast. We have to be faster. We need to reach the secret waterfall before they see us. Julian looked at the bronze compass. The needle was pointing higher up the mountain. The path was getting steeper and more difficult. The ground was made of loose stones that could slide at any moment. We leave no tracks, Julian ordered. Walk on the stones, not the dirt. Do not break any branches. We want the Admiral to think the jungle is empty. The crew started to move. They did not speak. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the sailors as they climbed the steep rocks. The sun was getting hotter, but Julian felt a cold chill. The hunt was on, and the Admiral was a very dangerous hunter. The mountain was very steep now. Julian and his crew moved slowly. They had to use their hands to pull themselves up the large rocks. The sun was hot, and their water bottles were almost empty. Julian looked back. He could not see the Admiral's soldiers yet, but he knew they were coming. The jungle was very quiet, which made him feel nervous. Suddenly, a new sound filled the air. It was not the sound of a bird or the wind. It was a deep, constant roar. It sounded like 1,000 drums beating at the same time. The air began to feel cool and wet. "Do you hear that?" Maria asked. She stopped to wipe water from her eyes. The air was full of a light, white mist. "It is water," Julian said. He looked at his compass. The needle was pointing directly toward the sound. The secret waterfall. We are very close. They walked around a giant wall of rock. On the other side, they saw something incredible. A wide river of white water fell from a high cliff. The water dropped into a deep, blue pool at the bottom. The force of the water created a cloud of mist that looked like a ghost in the trees. Around the pool, there were bright green ferns and flowers of every color. "It is beautiful," Leo whispered. He walked to the edge of the pool and splashed some cold water on his face. "But there is no temple here. There is only the mountain wall." Julian looked at the waterfall. The water was very thick and white. It looked like a solid curtain. He remembered an old story he heard in a tavern many years ago. The story said that the sun hides its treasure behind a veil of tears. "The temple is not on the mountain," Julian said. He pointed at the waterfall. "It is inside the mountain. The entrance is behind the water." The sailors looked at the falling water. It looked very heavy and dangerous. The sound was so loud that they had to shout to hear each other. "How do we get behind it?" Sam asked. "The water will push us into the rocks." Julian walked along the edge of the pool. He looked at the rocks behind the white curtain of water. He saw a small, dark ledge. It was narrow and slippery, but it led directly behind the waterfall. "We must walk on that ledge," Julian ordered. "One by one. Hold onto the rocks with both hands. Do not look down at the pool. Just move forward." Julian went first. He stepped onto the wet stone. The spray from the waterfall made his clothes heavy and cold. He felt the power of the water near his shoulder. It was a terrifying sound, like a giant animal growling in his ear. He moved slowly, inch by inch. Finally, he reached a place where the air was dry. He was behind the waterfall. He looked around. There was a large, dark opening in the rock. It was a cave. He waved his hand to Maria and the others. One by one, they crossed the dangerous ledge and joined him in the shadows. They were safe from the sun and the Admiral, but now they were standing at the mouth of a dark, unknown tunnel. The cave was very dark. Behind them, the waterfall was a wall of white light and a heavy, constant hum. In front of them, there was only blackness. The air was cold and smelled like wet earth and very old stone. Julian reached into his leather bag. He pulled out 2 long wooden torches. "Leo, help me with the light," Julian said. Julian used a small piece of flint and a metal striker. He hit them together until a small spark landed on the dry cloth of the torch. The orange fire grew quickly. The light pushed the shadows back. Julian gave the second torch to Leo. Now, they could see the walls of the cave. The walls were not rough like a natural cave. They were smooth and flat. Julian touched the stone with his hand. It felt cold and very solid. "This was not made by nature," Julian whispered. "People carved this tunnel a long time ago." They began to walk deeper into the mountain. The floor was slippery because of the wet mist from the waterfall. There were small puddles of water everywhere. The sound of their heavy boots echoed against the stone walls. It was a rhythmic, lonely sound. They moved slowly to avoid falling. High above their heads, Julian saw small bats sleeping on the ceiling. They looked like dark pieces of fruit hanging from the rock. The bats did not move as the pirates walked past. Everything in the cave felt like it was waiting. "Look at the walls," Maria said. She held her hand near the stone. Julian moved his torch closer. He saw small pictures carved into the wall. There were drawings of the sun, the moon, and many stars. There were also pictures of people rowing boats and carrying large boxes. It was the history of the island carved into the mountain itself. They were proud of their work, Maria said. They wanted everyone to know they were here. The tunnel began to go down. The air became a bit warmer, but it was also harder to breathe. Julian checked the bronze compass in his hand. The needle was steady. It pointed straight ahead. The path was very narrow now. Only one person could walk at a time. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a large, round room. The ceiling was so high that the light from the torches could not reach the top. In the center of the room, there was a large stone door. The door had no handle and no keyhole. It was covered in ancient symbols. "We are at the end of the path," Julian said. He walked up to the door. He felt a mix of excitement and fear. "But how do we get inside?" The sailors stood in the center of the dark room. The fire from the torches moved in a small breeze. They were deep inside the mountain now. Somewhere behind them, the admiral's soldiers were searching for the waterfall. Julian knew they had to find a way through the door before the soldiers arrived at the cave. The stone door was massive and cold. It blocked the entire tunnel. Julian held his torch high to see the carvings more clearly. There were many circles on the door. In the center of the door, there was a large carving of the sun with many long rays. Around the sun, there were smaller pictures of stars and moons. "There is no handle," Leo said. He pushed the stone with his shoulder, but the door did not move an inch. "It is too heavy. Even 10 men cannot push this open." Maria walked closer. She touched the carvings with her fingers. She was an adult who studied many old maps and books. She looked at the sun in the center. She noticed that the middle of the sun was a perfect circle, and it was empty. It was a hole that went deep into the stone. "Julian," Maria said softly, "look at the shape of the hole." Julian looked. The hole was exactly the same size as his bronze compass. He pulled the compass from his pocket. He felt his hands shake a little. He knew this was the moment of truth. If the compass was just a normal tool, they were trapped in this room. Suddenly, a faint sound came from the tunnel behind them. It was the sound of many boots hitting the wet stone. It was a distant, rhythmic noise. Then, they heard a voice. It was a cold, loud voice that Julian recognized. It was Admiral Vance. They went behind the waterfall. The Admiral shouted. His voice echoed through the cave. "Find them. Bring me that compass. They are coming." Sam whispered. He drew his sword. His face was pale in the torchlight. We have no place to hide. Maria, hold the torch. Julian ordered. Julian took the compass and placed it into the circular hole in the door. It was a perfect fit. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the compass began to glow with a soft, golden light. The light moved from the compass into the lines of the carvings on the door. One by one, the stone stars and moons began to shine. It is working, Maria cried. The heavy door made a deep, vibrating noise. It did not swing open like a normal door. Instead, it began to slide slowly into the wall. The sound of stone rubbing against stone was very loud in the small room. A cloud of dust fell from the ceiling. As the door moved, a new light appeared from the other side. It was not the orange light of a torch. It was a bright, yellow light that looked like a summer afternoon. Quickly! Inside! Julian shouted. The sailors ran through the opening. Julian reached out and pulled the compass back from the hole. The moment the compass was out, the door began to slide shut again. Julian looked back into the dark tunnel. He saw the orange light of the Admiral's torches at the end of the hallway. He saw the white uniform of a soldier. But the stone door was faster. It closed with a heavy, solid sound. The Admiral and his men were on the other side. Julian and his crew were safe for now. They turned around and gasped at what they saw. The room was giant. The walls were not rough grey stone. They were made of beautiful white marble. High above, there were small holes in the ceiling. The sunlight came through these holes in long, straight lines. The air was not dusty or wet. It smelled like dry paper and very old wood. Julian stood still. He could not believe his eyes. In the middle of the room, there were many long wooden tables. On the tables, there were massive piles of silver coins. They were not in bags or boxes. They were just sitting there, shining in the sunlight. There were also silver plates, silver cups, and small statues of animals made of silver. The floor was covered in a thin, sparkling layer of silver dust. It is like a dream, Leo said. He walked to a table and picked up a heavy silver cup. He looked at the bottom of the cup. There was a small carving of a bird. This cup is worth more than my ship. We are rich. Do not touch too much, Julian warned. He held his hand up. We do not know if there are more traps in this room. The ancients were very clever. Maria was not looking at the silver. She was looking at the walls. The walls were covered in large, colorful paintings. The colors were still very bright. There was deep red, bright blue, and a lot of yellow. The paintings showed the story of the island. They showed people building the mountain path and the stone statues. In the center of the largest wall, there was a painting of a giant golden statue. The statue looked like a man, but he had the face of a shining sun. This is a history room, Maria explained. She touched the wall gently. The silver is here to show the wealth of the people. But it is not the main treasure. The stories say the real treasure is at the heart of the mountain. We are looking for that golden statue. Julian walked to the end of the room. He saw another hallway. This hallway was much wider than the dark cave tunnel. The walls here had torches made of gold, but they were not burning. He looked at his bronze compass. The needle was pointing down the new hallway. The Admiral is behind that stone door, Sam reminded them. He looked back at the heavy entrance. He will find a way in soon. He has many soldiers and heavy tools. We must move quickly. Julian nodded. He felt a sense of wonder. This place was older than any city he knew. The people who lived here were gone, but their beauty and wealth remained. He looked at his crew. They were all looking at the silver with hungry eyes. Leave the silver for now, Julian ordered. "We cannot carry heavy coins and run from the navy. We are looking for the heart of the temple. We must find the sun statue before the admiral catches us." The sailors put down the silver cups. They followed Julian into the wide hallway. The light from the chamber stayed behind them. They were moving deeper into the mountain, away from the ocean and toward the ultimate secret of the island. The wide hallway felt like a bridge between two worlds. The white marble floor continued, but now the walls were decorated with thin lines of real gold. The lines formed shapes of waves and stars. Julian held his torch high, but he did not really need it. The light from the chamber behind them reflected off the gold walls, making the hallway glow with a soft, yellow light. "We are very deep inside the mountain now," Maria said. She walked close to the wall. She looked at the gold lines. "The air is warm. It feels like the sun is right next to us." The hallway ended at a set of giant double doors. These doors were not made of stone. They were made of dark, heavy wood and covered in gold plates. Julian pushed the doors. They moved silently on their hinges. It was a smooth and perfect movement that showed the skill of the ancient builders. When the doors opened, the crew stopped. No one spoke. No one moved. They were standing at the edge of the grand chamber. This room was the largest space Julian had ever seen. The ceiling was a massive dome of blue stone. In the very center of the dome, there was a large circular hole. A thick beam of bright, natural sunlight came down from the sky. The light hit the center of the room like a spotlight. In the middle of the light stood the golden statue. It was magnificent. The statue was 5 meters tall. It was a man with a powerful body and a calm face. He held his hands out toward the ceiling, as if he were catching the sun. His face was not a human face. It was a large, shining sun with long, sharp rays. The entire statue was made of pure, solid gold. It was so bright that it hurt Julian's eyes to look at it directly. "It is real," Leo whispered. He walked toward the center of the room. His boots made a soft sound on the marble floor. "The golden statue of the sun. It is the most beautiful thing in the world." The floor around the statue was covered in thousands of precious stones. There were red rubies, blue sapphires, and green emeralds. They lay on the floor like colorful rain. The light from the sun hit the statue, and then the statue reflected the light onto the gems. The whole room was a rainbow of colors. Julian walked slowly toward the statue. He felt very small. He was a captain of a pirate ship, and he saw many treasures in his life. But this was different. This was not just money. This was art and history. "Captain, we did it," Sam said. He was smiling, but there were tears in his eyes. He was an adult who worked hard all his life, and now he was standing in front of a legend. Julian reached out his hand. He wanted to touch the gold. He wanted to know if it was warm from the sun. But as he moved closer, he remembered the traps. He looked at the floor carefully. He looked at the way the light moved. "Wait," Julian said. He stopped his crew. "Do not touch the statue yet. The admiral is close, and this room is the heart of the temple. The most important treasure always has the most dangerous protection." The room was silent for a moment as the crew looked at the gold. Then, a heavy sound came from the hallway. It was the sound of metal hitting stone and many feet running. Julian turned his head quickly. The large wooden doors they just passed through were pushed open with great force. Admiral Vance walked into the room. He was not alone. Behind him were 20 soldiers. They wore their clean white uniforms, but their clothes were wet and dirty from the jungle. They held long rifles and sharp swords. Their faces were hard and cold. The admiral looked at the golden statue, and his eyes grew wide. A hungry smile appeared on his face. "So, it is real," the admiral said. His voice was loud and full of pride. "The golden sun of the ancients. You did the hard work for me. Julian. You found the path, and you opened the door. Now, move away from the gold. Julian stepped in front of his crew. He placed his hand on the hilt of his sword. Maria, Leo, and Sam stood behind him. They were outnumbered, but they were not ready to give up. This gold does not belong to you, Admiral, Julian said. It belongs to this island. It is protected. If you take it, you do not know what will happen. The Admiral laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. He walked forward, and his soldiers moved with him. They formed a half-circle around Julian's crew. The points of their swords sparkled in the sunlight from the ceiling. I am a man of the Navy, the Admiral replied. I do not believe in old stories or protection. I only believe in gold and power. This statue will be melted down and given to the king. And you, Julian, will be taken back to the city in chains. We found the compass. We took the risks, Maria shouted. She looked at the soldiers with anger. You are a thief in a white uniform. The Admiral ignored her. He looked at the golden rays of the statue's face. He was mesmerized. Soldiers, take their weapons. If they move, use your swords. I want that compass, too. Two soldiers moved toward Julian. Julian looked at Maria. He saw the same thought in her eyes. They were trapped in the center of the room. The soldiers were closing in. The situation looked impossible. But Julian noticed something. Behind the golden statue, near the far wall, there was a small shadow. It was a hidden door, partially covered by a golden curtain. Now! Julian whispered to his crew. He did not draw his sword to fight. Instead, he grabbed a handful of the sparkling gems from the floor and threw them at the soldiers. The bright stones flew through the air like colorful rain, distracting the men for a few seconds. In that moment of confusion, Julian and his crew turned and ran toward the shadow in the wall. Stop them! The Admiral screamed. His face turned red with anger. The chase was on. The quiet temple was now full of the sound of running feet and the shouts of angry men. Julian reached the golden curtain and pushed it aside. There was a small, dark hallway. The dark hallway was very narrow. Julian pushed through the golden curtain first, and his crew followed him quickly. The air here was old and dry. It smelled like dust and ancient paper. Behind them, they could hear the loud shouts of the Admiral and the heavy sound of many soldiers running. The floor was made of smooth stone, and it was very easy to run fast. Stay close, Julian whispered. He did not want to lose anyone in the darkness. They ran for several minutes. The hallway turned to the left and then to the right. It was like a maze. Julian held his torch low to see the ground. He did not want to trip on a loose stone or another hidden trap. Maria was right behind him. She was breathing fast, but her face was calm. She was an adult who knew how to stay cool in a dangerous situation. Suddenly, the hallway opened into a small, square room. In the middle of the room, there was a large wooden wheel on the wall. Julian stopped. He looked back at the hallway. The light from the soldiers' torches was getting brighter on the walls. They were very close. Leo, help me with this wheel, Julian cried. Leo ran to the wall. He was a very strong man. He grabbed one side of the wheel, and Julian grabbed the other. They pushed with all their strength. The wheel was very old and heavy. At first, it did not move. Julian felt the muscles in his arms get tight and painful. He heard the sound of a soldier's boot very close now. Push! Maria shouted. She also put her hands on the wheel to help. The wheel made a deep, grinding sound of wood against metal. Slowly, it began to turn. As the wheel turned, a heavy stone door began to slide across the entrance of the hallway they just used. The door was very thick. It moved inch by inch. A soldier appeared at the end of the hallway. He saw the pirates and raised his rifle. "There they are," he shouted. But it was too late. The heavy stone door closed with a solid, final sound. The hallway was gone. On the other side, they heard the soldiers hitting the stone with their weapons. But the door did not move. The pirates were safe for a few minutes. "That will stop them for a while," Sam said. He sat on the floor and tried to catch his breath. He was very tired. Julian looked around the new room. There were no other doors. There was only a set of steep stone stairs going down into the floor. The stairs were dark and looked very old. "Where do those go?" Leo asked. He looked at the deep, dark hole in the floor. "I do not know," Julian replied. He pulled out the bronze compass. The needle was pointing down the stairs. "But the compass says we must go this way. The Admiral will find a way around that door soon. We must keep moving." Julian led the way down the stairs. Each step was high and difficult. The darkness seemed to swallow the light from his torch. They were going deeper into the mountain, away from the gold and into the unknown parts of the temple. The stairs finally ended at the edge of a massive, hollow space. This was not a room with white marble or golden walls. It was a giant natural cavern. Julian held his torch high, but the light could not reach the far walls. In front of them was a deep, dark pit. It looked like a giant mouth waiting to swallow anything that fell. "There is only one way across," Maria said. She pointed her finger toward a thin line of rock. A narrow bridge of stones stretched across the darkness. It was very old and had no railings or ropes to hold onto. The bridge was only wide enough for one person to walk at a time. Some of the stones looked thin and cracked. A cold wind blew up from the deep hole, making a low whistling sound as it moved through the cavern. "I do not like heights," Leo whispered. He was a brave sailor on the ocean, but this bridge made him feel very nervous. "If one stone breaks, we are gone." "We cannot go back," Julian said. "The Admiral's soldiers will find the secret stairs soon. We must cross now. I will go first." Julian stepped onto the first stone. It felt cold and solid under his boot. He moved slowly, putting one foot in front of the other. He kept his arms out to his sides to help his balance. He did not look down into the black pit. He only looked at the next stone. The wind pushed against his long coat, trying to move him. He felt his heart beating fast in his chest. When Julian reached the middle of the bridge, a small stone moved under his foot. He stopped immediately. He waited for the bridge to be still again. He took a slow, deep breath. Then, he continued. Finally, his boot touched the solid floor on the other side. He turned around and waved his torch to the others. "Come, one by one." Julian called out. His voice echoed in the giant space. Maria went next. She moved with focus and grace. She did not stop until she reached Julian's side. Then came Sam. Sam was halfway across when a piece of the bridge broke off. The stone fell into the pit. There was no sound for a long time, and then a very faint noise came from the darkness far below. Sam froze. His face turned very pale in the torchlight. "Do not look down, Sam," Julian said in a calm, steady voice. "Just take a small step forward. You can do it." Sam closed his eyes for a moment. Then he moved. He reached the other side and sat on the ground, breathing hard. Finally, Leo crossed. He moved very quickly, almost running, until he reached the solid floor. He was shaking, but he was safe. "I never want to do that again," Leo said. Julian looked back at the thin bridge. It was the only path into this part of the mountain. He hoped the Admiral's soldiers would be afraid of the height. But he knew the Admiral was a greedy man who would push his soldiers to do anything. "We must continue," Julian said. He looked at the bronze compass. "The needle is still pointing forward. We are getting very close to the map room." They walked into a new tunnel. The air felt heavy and thick here. They were deep inside the mountain, and the secrets of the island of the sun were waiting for them. The tunnel opened into a room that was different from all the others. It was perfectly round, and the walls were covered in smooth, black stone that looked like the night sky. There was no gold or silver here. Instead, thousands of tiny, glowing crystals were set into the walls. They looked like stars, and they gave off a soft, silver light that made the room feel cold and quiet. In the center of the room, the floor was not flat. It was a giant, sunken bowl made of polished marble. Inside the bowl, there were hundreds of small stone islands sitting in a pool of dark, still water. "It is a map," Maria whispered. She walked to the edge of the bowl and looked down. "It is not just a map of the island. It is a map of the entire ocean." Julian walked around the edge. He saw San Porto, the Reef of Bones, and the Island of the Sun. The detail was incredible. Each stone island had tiny carvings of mountains, forests, and even the secret waterfall. It was a masterwork of ancient geography. "This is how they knew where everything was," Julian said. He looked at the ceiling. High above, there were more crystals, arranged in the shapes of the constellations. They used the stars to guide their ships, just like we do, but they recorded everything here, in the heart of the mountain. Julian pulled out the bronze compass. As he approached the center of the room, the needle began to spin rapidly. He noticed a small, raised stone pedestal standing in the middle of the water map. The pedestal had a circular indent on the top, similar to the one on the puzzle door. "If we want to find a way out, we need to activate the map," Julian said. He stepped onto a narrow stone path that led to the center of the bowl. He placed the compass into the pedestal. A low, humming sound began to vibrate through the floor. The water in the bowl started to glow with a deep blue light. Suddenly, a beam of light shot up from the compass and hit the ceiling. The crystals on the walls and ceiling began to shine brighter, reflecting the light back down into the water. A path of bright green light appeared in the water, moving away from the island of the sun. It wound through hidden reefs and underwater caves that were not on any modern map. "That is the way out," Julian realized. "It is a secret passage through the rocks that the Star of the Sea can follow. We do not have to go back past the Reef of Bones." "Captain!" Sam shouted from the entrance of the room. He was pointing back toward the tunnel. "I see light. The Admiral's soldiers are in the cavern. They are crossing the bridge." The sound of a distant gunshot echoed through the stone halls. The Admiral was no longer trying to be quiet. He was angry and desperate to catch them. "We have what we need," Julian said. He grabbed the compass from the pedestal. The map stayed glowing for a moment, burned into his memory. "Maria, there is a small door behind the pedestal, under the water level. It must be the exit to the sea." They didn't have time to admire the stars anymore. The Admiral was close, and the peaceful silence of the map room was about to be broken by the sound of war. The Admiral's voice was like a whip, cracking through the quiet air of the map room. "There they are. Do not let them reach the water." Julian didn't look back. He knew the soldiers were only seconds away. He focused on the small stone door Maria had spotted. It was located behind the central pedestal, partially submerged in the dark, still water of the map bowl. It wasn't a grand gold door. It was a rough, functional exit meant for those who knew the temple's deepest secrets. "Leo, help me lift this," Julian shouted. There was no wheel here, only a heavy iron ring set into the stone. Julian and Leo grabbed the ring together. The water was cold as it splashed over their boots. They pulled upward with a loud grunt. The stone slab moved with a heavy, wet sound, revealing a dark, sloping tunnel that smelled strongly of salt and seaweed. "Into the tunnel. Go!" Julian ordered. Sam scrambled in first, followed by Maria. Just as Leo was about to enter, the first of the Admiral's soldiers reached the entrance of the map room. A rifle shot rang out, the bullet hitting the marble floor and sending sparks into the air. "Get in, Leo." Julian pushed the big sailor into the darkness and then jumped in himself. As he fell into the tunnel, Julian reached back and kicked a small stone wedge he had noticed earlier. The heavy slab dropped back into place with a definitive thud, cutting off the light and the sounds of the soldiers. They were in total darkness now, sliding down a smooth, wet chute. The slide was fast and terrifying. The tunnel twisted and turned through the very roots of the mountain. Julian could feel the air getting thicker and more humid. The sound of the ocean, which had been a distant hum, was now a loud, crashing roar. Suddenly, the slide ended. Julian flew out of the tunnel and landed in a pool of cold, salty water. He surfaced, gasping for air, and saw the others splashing nearby. They were in a massive sea cave at the base of the island's cliffs. High above, through a jagged opening in the rock, he could see the grey light of the late afternoon. "Is everyone okay?" Julian asked, his voice echoing off the wet cave walls. "I'm wet. I'm tired, but I'm alive," Sam replied, shivering. Maria pointed toward the mouth of the cave. "Look, the Star of the Sea." Outside the cave, the ocean was choppy. The Star of the Sea was bobbing in the waves, a few hundred meters away. Silas had moved the ship closer to the cliffs, just as Julian had hoped. But there was a problem. The iron whale was also moving. The Admiral's massive ship was turning its heavy hull, its black cannons pointed directly toward the cave entrance. "They know we're here," Julian said grimly. "They're going to block our escape." The pirates were out of the mountain, but they were now caught between the jagged rocks of the island and the deadly cannons of the navy. The cold water of the cove splashed against Julian's face as he swam with powerful strokes toward the Star of the Sea. Behind him, Maria, Leo, and Sam were doing the same. The distance felt like miles, even though it was only a few hundred meters. Above them, the cliffs of the island loomed like giant, silent observers. "Silas, drop the ladders!" Julian shouted as loud as he could, his voice competing with the roar of the surf. On the deck of the pirate ship, Silas moved with incredible speed. He had seen his captain emerge from the cave and already had the crew ready. Ropes and wooden ladders hit the water just as Julian reached the hull. The pirates scrambled up the side of the ship, their wet clothes heavy and dripping. "Captain, thank the stars you're alive," Silas cried, helping Julian over the railing. "The iron whale is moving in. They've already signaled us to surrender." "We're not surrendering, Silas," Julian gasped, wiping salt from his eyes. "Man the stations. We're taking the ship through the shadow gap." Silas looked at the narrow, jagged rocks at the far end of the cove. "Captain, that's suicide. No ship can fit through those needles of stone." The map room showed a path. Julian insisted, pointing toward the crashing foam. "It's a deep water channel hidden by the spray. The iron whale is too wide to follow us there. It's our only chance." A thunderous explosion echoed across the water. The iron whale had fired its first warning shot. A massive ball of iron hit the water 50 meters from their stern, sending a skyscraper of white spray into the air. The vibration shook the deck beneath Julian's boots. "They aren't warning us anymore," Maria said, her eyes fixed on the Admiral's ship. "They're aiming to sink us." "All hands to the sails," Julian commanded. "Leo, Sam, get to the cannons. But do not fire unless I say. We need speed, not a fight." The Star of the Sea groaned as the wind caught its white sails. The ship began to lean and cut through the waves. The iron whale fired again. This time, the shot was closer. A piece of the wooden railing on the upper deck shattered into splinters. Julian took the large steering wheel from the helmsman. He could feel the power of the ocean through the wood. He looked at the compass in his pocket, It wasn't glowing anymore, but the image of the green path from the map room was burned into his mind. He steered the ship directly toward the wall of rocks. "Captain, we're going to hit." A sailor screamed. "Hold steady." Julian roared. "Trust the map." The ship flew toward the foam. The rocks looked like giant teeth ready to crush the wooden hull. Just as it seemed they would crash, a narrow opening appeared behind a veil of mist. The Star of the Sea tilted sharply as Julian turned the wheel, sliding into a hidden channel barely wider than the ship itself. Behind them, the Iron Whale let out a final, frustrated volley of cannon fire. But the shots hit the outer rocks, sending stone dust into the air. The pirates were in the secret passage, moving fast through the heart of the reefs. The walls of the secret passage were so high and close that they blocked out most of the late afternoon sun. The Star of the Sea moved through a world of grey stone and white foam. The sound of the waves echoing off the cliffs was like the roar of 1,000 lions. Julian gripped the wheel until his knuckles were white. He wasn't just steering a ship. He was threading a needle. "Watch the starboard side." Maria yelled from the bow. She was leaning over the edge, her eyes wide as she watched the jagged stone. "The rocks are just inches away." Julian adjusted the wheel by a hair's breadth. He could hear the barnacles on the rocks scraping against the very edge of the ship's wooden hull. It was a terrifying, screeching sound. Any mistake now would rip the ship open like a piece of paper. The water in the channel was swirling and unpredictable, full of hidden currents that tried to push the ship against the stone. "Steady, my girl," Julian whispered to the ship. "Just a little further." Looking back, he could see the Iron Whale through the entrance of the gap. The Admiral's ship had stopped, its massive size making it impossible to follow. But Admiral Vance wasn't giving up. Julian saw the flash of the long-range chaser cannons. The heavy iron balls flew high over the rocks, falling into the channel with massive splashes that rocked the Star of the Sea. One ball hit a high cliff above them, sending a rain of stone and dust onto the deck. "They're trying to collapse the walls on us," Silas shouted, shielding his head as debris hit the wood. "Ignore them," Julian commanded. "Eyes forward. There's the exit." At the end of the dark, narrow passage, Julian could see a sliver of the open horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep reds and violets. The path in the water, just as he remembered from the map room, took a sharp, final turn to the left. "Brace yourselves," Julian cried. He threw the wheel over. The Star of the Sea leaned so far to the side that the railing nearly touched the water. The sailors held onto ropes and masts, their faces tight with fear and determination. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, the ship shot out from between the two final pillars of rock and into the deep, blue water of the open ocean. The silence that followed was shocking. The roar of the narrow channel was replaced by the steady, rhythmic sound of the deep sea. The crew stood still for a moment. Then a massive cheer erupted from the deck. They had done it. They had escaped the island and the Admiral. Julian let go of the wheel, his hands shaking slightly from the effort. He looked back at the island of the sun. It was now a dark silhouette against the sunset. The Iron Whale was still on the other side of the reefs, a distant, angry speck. "We're clear, Captain," Maria said, walking up to him. She looked exhausted but triumphant. Julian pulled the bronze compass from his pocket. It was just a piece of metal again, cold and silent, but it had led them home, or at least, back to the world they knew. "Set a course for San Porto," Julian ordered, a small smile finally reaching his face. "We have stories to tell, and a crew to feed." The night was peaceful. The Star of the Sea sailed across a calm, black ocean that looked like liquid velvet. Above, the sky was filled with 1,000,000 stars, and a giant silver moon hung low on the horizon. The sound of the wind in the sails was no longer a roar, but a soft, comforting whisper. For the first time in days, the crew felt truly safe. On the main deck, the sailors were gathered around a series of small lanterns. They weren't cleaning or repairing today. They were celebrating. In the center of the circle, Leo and Sam had placed the leather bags they carried out of the first chamber of the temple. "It's time to see what we really have," Leo said, his voice full of excitement. He opened the first bag and poured the contents onto a wooden table. A waterfall of silver coins and precious gems spilled out, sparkling under the lantern light. There were silver plates, small emerald-encrusted jewelry, and a handful of the rainbow-colored stones Julian had thrown as a distraction. Even though they hadn't taken the giant golden statue, the silver they had gathered was more wealth than any of them had seen in their entire lives. "It's enough," Maria said, standing beside Julian. She picked up a silver coin and watched it catch the moonlight. "It's enough to fix the ship, buy Leo his farm, and give every person on this deck a life of comfort. We don't need the sun statue. That belongs to the island." "You're right," Julian agreed. He looked at his crew. Their faces were glowing with joy, but they weren't fighting over the coins. They were sharing stories of the Bridge of Stones and the puzzle door. The real treasure, Julian realized, was the bond they had formed in the darkness of the mountain. Silas walked up to Julian, holding 2 mugs of fresh water. "The men are happy, Captain. But what about the Admiral? The Iron Whale is a fast ship. If they find another way through those reefs, they'll be after us." Julian looked back toward the west. The island of the sun was long gone, hidden below the curve of the earth. "The Admiral is a man who follows rules and maps. Silas. He doesn't understand the heart of the sea. By the time he finds a path around the shadow gap, we'll be a ghost in the fog. He lost today because he wanted the gold for his king. We won because we wanted to survive for each other." The celebration continued late into the night. There was music. Someone had found an old accordion, and the smell of a hot meal being cooked in the galley. Julian walked to the back of the ship and pulled the bronze compass from his pocket one last time. The needle didn't vibrate. It didn't glow. It simply pointed north, toward the familiar port of San Porto. The magic of the island had faded, or perhaps it was just waiting for the next person brave enough to follow a dream. Julian felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since he was a young boy. "Tomorrow we reach the trade routes," Julian told Maria as she joined him at the railing. "And then, San Porto. And after that?" she asked, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Julian looked at the endless horizon. "After that, we'll see where the wind takes us. The world is a very big place, Maria, and I think we have a few more maps to draw." The familiar flickering light of the San Porto lighthouse appeared on the horizon like a lonely star. For any other ship, it was a symbol of safety and home. For the crew of the Star of the Sea, it was a warning. Julian stood at the bow, his wet coat finally dry but stiff with salt. He watched the distant glow and felt a heavy knot in his stomach. They were returning as the richest pirates in the Caribbean, but they were also the most wanted. "We can't go to the main docks, Julian," Maria said, stepping up beside him. She had traded her torn adventuring clothes for a clean linen shirt, but she still kept her sword strapped tight. "The Admiral's report will have reached the governor by now. Every soldier with a rifle will be waiting for the Star of the Sea to show its face." Julian nodded. "I know. We'll head for the Oyster Bay on the western side of the cliffs. It's shallow and rocky, but Silas can handle it. We'll drop anchor in the mist and use the small boats to bring the silver ashore." As the ship glided into the dark, quiet waters of the hidden bay, the crew moved like ghosts. There was no singing or cheering now. They knew that the final part of their journey, the part where they actually got to keep their prize, was the most dangerous. Silas managed the anchor with silent precision, and the heavy chain barely made a splash. Once the ship was secure, Julian gathered the crew on the deck. The silver coins and jewels from the temple were packed into small, nondescript wooden crates. They didn't look like treasure. They looked like crates of salted fish or cheap grain. "Listen to me," Julian said, his voice a low, commanding whisper. "We are going to divide a small portion of the silver tonight. Each of you will take enough to find a warm bed and a hot meal in the city. But do not spend it all at once. Do not buy silk coats or gold rings. If the guards see a common sailor throwing silver coins around like sand, they will know where it came from." Leo stepped forward, his face serious. "And the rest of the treasure, Captain? We can't carry 10 crates into the taverns. The rest stays hidden." Julian replied, "Maria and I will meet with old Barnaby at the Drowned Rat Tavern. He knows the secret tunnels under the city. We'll move the crates into the old wine cellars until the Admiral's anger cools down. Once the Navy stops searching every ship in the harbor, we will meet again and divide the rest fairly." The sailors nodded in agreement. They were adults who had lived through a storm and a temple of traps. They understood that patience was the only thing between them and a hangman's rope. As the first small boat touched the sandy shore of Oyster Bay, Julian looked back at his ship. The Star of the Sea looked tired. Her sails were patched, and her wood was scarred by cannon fire. She had carried them to the edge of the world and back. Julian realized that the treasure was wonderful, but the ship was his true home. The walk into the city was quiet. They used the back alleys and the narrow paths between the warehouses. San Porto smelled of smoke, old wood, and the salty sea. As they reached the outskirts of the market, they saw a group of soldiers pinning a large piece of paper to a wooden post. Julian waited for the soldiers to walk away. Then he stepped closer to read it. It was a wanted poster. In the center, there was a drawing of his own face. Below it, in bold black letters, it read, 1,000 gold coins for the capture of the pirate Julian. Wanted dead or alive. The Admiral is very angry. Maria whispered, looking over his shoulder. "Good," Julian said, a cold smile crossing his face. "It means we did something right." The fog in San Porto was thick enough to hide a ghost, and tonight, Julian and Maria were exactly that. They moved through the Salt District, a maze of narrow alleys and leaning wooden houses where the smell of fish and wet rope never truly left the air. Every few minutes, the rhythmic clinking of metal armor echoed against the cobblestones. The city watch was out in force. "This way," Maria whispered, pulling Julian into a dark doorway as a group of 4 soldiers marched past. Their lanterns cast long, swinging shadows that danced like giants on the walls. Julian held his breath, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He could see his own face on the wanted poster pasted to the wall opposite them, mocking him in the dim light. Once the soldiers were gone, they hurried toward a low, sagging building near the water's edge. A sign shaped like a waterlogged rodent swung lazily in the breeze. The Drowned Rat. It was the kind of place where honest men didn't go, and where the dishonest ones kept their eyes on the floor. Julian pushed the heavy oak door open. The air inside was warm and thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and spilled ale. At a corner table sat a man who looked like he was carved from an old piece of driftwood. This was old Barnaby, a former smuggler who knew the hidden veins of the city better than anyone alive. "Julian," Barnaby rasped, his eyes barely lifting from his mug. "You've got a lot of nerve showing your face here. The governor has doubled the reward for your head since the sun went down. They say you robbed the king's own admiral." "The admiral tried to rob the sea, Barnaby," Julian replied, sitting down across from him. "We need a place to move some cargo, crates that can't be seen by the tax collectors." Barnaby let out a wheezing laugh. "Crates, is it? I heard rumors of silver and gems that look like the rainbow. The whole city is talking about the pirate who found the sun's gold." Julian leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "I don't care about the rumors. I care about the wine tunnels. Are they still clear?" Barnaby's expression turned serious. He took a slow sip of his drink and nodded. "Mostly." The city watch blocked the entrance near the cathedral, but the tunnels under the old soap factory are still open. They lead straight to the cellars of the abandoned warehouse on Pier 9. They quickly worked out a plan. Leo and Silas would start a small, harmless fire in a trash heap near the main docks to draw the guards away. Julian and Maria would move the crates using handcarts through the fog. The treasure would be locked in Barnaby's special cellar until the heat died down. "I want 10% for the storage and the silence," Barnaby stated. 5%. Julian countered. "And I'll give you a sapphire the size of a pigeon's egg right now." He slid a small, glowing blue stone across the table. Barnaby's eyes widened as the gem caught the light of a nearby candle. He quickly snatched it up and tucked it into his pocket. "Deal. Get your men. The fog won't last forever." As Julian and Maria stood to leave, the tavern door flew open. A young boy, breathless and wide-eyed, shouted, "The Navy! They're searching the Salt District house by house. They have the Admiral's personal guard with them." Julian looked at Maria. The window of opportunity was closing faster than they had expected. They didn't just have to hide the treasure now. They had to hide themselves. The boy's warning hung in the smoke-filled air of the tavern like a death sentence. The patrons of the Drowned Rat, usually loud and rowdy, fell into a terrified silence. In San Porto, when the Admiral's personal guard conducted a search, doors weren't just knocked on, they were kicked off their hinges. "Out the back, now!" Barnaby hissed, pointing his gnarled finger toward a heavy velvet curtain behind the bar. "There's a coal chute that leads to the saw line. It's filthy, but it'll get you past the perimeter." Julian didn't hesitate. He grabbed Maria's arm and ducked behind the curtain. They scrambled down a narrow, soot-covered slide and landed in a pile of damp coal dust. The air outside was thick with the scent of sea salt and the acrid smell of burning torches. The fog had rolled in even heavier, a white wall that turned the street lamps into blurry, orange ghosts. "We have to get back to the crates," Julian whispered, wiping soot from his forehead. "If the guards find Silas and the others at the soap factory entrance before we get there, we lose everything." They moved with the practiced stealth of predators. Julian knew these streets. He had grown up running through these same alleys long before he ever stepped onto a ship. They climbed a low stone wall and skirted the edge of the old tanner's yard, where the smell of chemicals masked their own scent. In the distance, the sound of iron-shod boots, rhythmic and heavy, pounded against the cobblestones. Suddenly, a voice rang out, sharp, cold, and unmistakably authoritative. "Search every cellar. If the doors are locked, break them. I want Julian's head before the sun rises." It was Admiral Vance. He was close, perhaps only 2 streets away. The man's obsession had turned into a fever. He wasn't just looking for a criminal. He was hunting a ghost that had humiliated him. Julian and Maria reached the abandoned soap factory, a skeletal building of brick and broken glass. Silas and Leo were waiting in the shadows of the loading dock, hovering over the 4 handcarts loaded with the salted fish crates. Their faces were pale, their hands white-knuckled as they gripped the handles. "Captain, the city is crawling with them," Silas whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "We heard the Admiral. He's moved a line of soldiers across the main bridge. We're cut off from the tunnels." Julian looked at the carts, then at the thick fog. An idea formed in the back of his mind, a dangerous, desperate gamble. "We're not going around them, Silas," Julian said, his eyes narrowing. "We're going through them. The fog is thick enough that they can't see faces from more than 5 paces. Leo, take off that pirate's sash. Silas, put on that old merchant's cap. We're just four poor laborers moving spoiled cargo to the burn pits." It was a bold move. They moved the carts out into the open street, the wooden wheels creaking rhythmically. They walked slowly, heads down, imitating the tired slump of men who had worked an 18-hour shift. As they approached the intersection of Gallows Way, a squad of 6 soldiers emerged from the mist. Their bayonets gleamed. "Halt!" The lead guard commanded, stepping forward. He held a lantern up, the light swinging toward Julian's face. Julian didn't look up. He coughed, a wet, hacking sound, and leaned heavily on his cart. "Just moving the rot, sir," he muttered in a thick, gravelly voice. "Factory boss wants it gone before the morning inspection." The guard wrinkled his nose at the smell of the old soap and damp wood. He looked at the crates, then at the 4 laborers. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Julian's hand stayed close to the dagger hidden in his sleeve. "Move along." The guard finally grunted, waving them through. "And stay off the main square. The Admiral is in a foul mood." They pushed the carts forward, not daring to breathe until they were back in the shadows. They had made it past the first line, but the entrance to the wine tunnels was still 3 blocks away, and the Admiral's voice was getting louder. The cobblestones were Julian's greatest enemy. Even with the fog acting as a muffler, the heavy wooden wheels of the handcarts made a rhythmic sound that sounded like thunder in the quiet street. Every time a wheel hit a gap in the stone, the salted fish inside the crates shifted with a metallic chime that made Julian's skin crawl. "We need to muffle the wheels," Julian whispered, stopping the group in the shadow of a leaning warehouse. "Silas, Leo, take off your coats. Wrap them around the iron rims. Use the twine from the crates to tie them tight." As the men worked, Maria stood at the corner of the alley, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. The fog was pulsing with the orange light of distant torches. The Admiral's search was tightening like a noose. They could hear the heavy boots of the soldiers moving into the neighboring street. "Hurry," she urged, her voice barely a breath. "I see silhouettes at the end of the lane. They're checking the chimneys for smoke. It won't be long before they look in the shadows." With the wheels muffled by the heavy wool of their coats, the carts moved with a ghostly silence. They reached the entrance to the old soap factory, a skeletal ruin of brick and rotted timber. The air here was foul, thick with the scent of lye and stagnant water. Barnaby had told them the entrance to the wine tunnels was beneath the main vat in the basement. They pushed the carts into the dark maw of the factory. The floorboards groaned under the weight. Julian led them to the center of the room, where a massive iron vat sat like a rusted bell. Beneath it, hidden by a layer of filth and discarded rags, was a heavy wooden hatch bound in iron. "Leo, give me a hand," Julian said. The 2 men gripped the iron ring and pulled. The hatch didn't budge. It was swollen from the damp and rusted shut by decades of neglect. From the street outside, a voice rang out, closer than ever. "Check that factory. Leave no stone unturned." It was the Admiral's lieutenant. "It's stuck," Leo hissed, his face turning red with the effort. Julian pulled out his dagger and jammed it into the seam of the wood, prying with all his strength. The wood groaned. He signaled Silas and Maria to join them. All 4 pirates gripped the ring, their feet slipping on the slick floor. With a sudden, wet sound, the hatch flew open, revealing a dark, vertical shaft with a rotted ladder. "Get the crates down. Now," Julian commanded. They used a length of rope to lower the heavy boxes into the darkness. 1, 2, 3. As they were lowering the 4th crate, the rope slipped through Silas's wet hands. The crate hit the stone floor of the tunnel below with a deafening impact. The wood shattered, and a river of silver coins burst out, singing a loud, bright song that echoed up the shaft and out into the foggy street. "What was that?" A soldier shouted from the loading dock. "In there." Light the torches. Go! Go! Julian shoved Maria and Silas toward the hole. Leo jumped next, disappearing into the dark. Julian grabbed the last crate and balanced it on the edge of the hole. He looked back and saw the orange glow of lanterns spilling into the factory. The silhouettes of 3 soldiers appeared in the doorway, their muskets leveled. Halt! Julian didn't halt. He kicked the final crate into the shaft and jumped in after it, his fingers catching the edge of the hatch as he fell. He pulled the door shut just as a musket ball splintered the wood inches from his face. He tumbled into the dark, landing on a pile of shattered wood and cold, hard silver. The darkness in the tunnel was absolute, broken only by the faint, dying glow of a lantern Silas had managed to keep lit during the fall. Julian lay on his back for a second, the breath knocked out of him. The floor was cold and wet, and beneath him, he felt the hard, unforgiving edges of the silver coins that had spilled from the shattered crate. Above, the muffled sound of musket butts slamming against the wooden hatch echoed like distant thunder. "Is everyone whole?" Julian rasped, pushing himself up. "I think my pride is bruised, but my legs still work." Leo groaned from the shadows. He was already on his hands and knees, frantically scooping handfuls of silver back into the remains of the wooden box. "We don't have time to be neat, Leo," Maria hissed. She was standing near the base of the ladder, her eyes fixed on the sliver of light leaking through the cracks in the hatch above. "They know we're down here. They'll find the main stairs to the cellar in minutes." Julian grabbed a discarded burlap sack from a corner and began shoveling the coins into it. The sound of the silver clinking was dangerously loud in the cramped stone space. The air here was heavy and sour, smelling of ancient vinegar and rotted corks. These tunnels had once been the pride of San Porto's vintners, but now they were a crumbling labyrinth of forgotten history. "Follow the flow of the air," Julian ordered, slinging the heavy bag of silver over his shoulder. Barnaby said the tunnels slope downward toward the harbor. "If we stay on the lower levels, we can reach the warehouse at Pier 9. They moved quickly, their shadows dancing wildly against the damp, vaulted walls. The tunnel was narrow, forced between massive stone pillars that supported the weight of the city above. As they ran, Julian could hear the faint sounds of life from the streets over their heads, the distant rattle of a carriage, the bark of a dog, and the rhythmic marching of the Admiral's men. It was a strange feeling, being inches away from their pursuers yet separated by 6 feet of solid earth. Suddenly, the tunnel split into 3 identical branches. The stone walls were lined with rows of ancient, dusty bottles, most of them broken. Julian stopped, his heart hammering. He looked at the ground, searching for the marks Barnaby had described. "The middle one," Silas whispered, pointing to a small, carved symbol of a rat on the keystone of the arch. "Barnaby's mark." As they stepped into the middle passage, a new sound reached them. It wasn't from above, it was from behind. A low, splashing sound, like boots moving through shallow water. They found the drainage entrance, Maria said, drawing her sword. The steel hissed as it left the scabbard. "They're in the tunnels with us. Keep moving," Julian urged. "We can't fight them in a bottleneck. We need to reach the Great Vault. There are more exits there." They hurried deeper into the maze. The ground became slicker, and the walls began to weep with moisture. The silver in Julian's bag felt heavier with every step, a constant reminder of the price they might pay for their greed. Behind them, the light of enemy torches began to flicker against the damp stones, growing brighter with every passing second. The hunt had moved from the foggy streets to the belly of the city. The tunnel finally widened, and the ceiling soared upward into a massive, echoing chamber. This was the Great Vault, the heart of San Porto's subterranean network. It was an octagonal room, its walls lined with rotting oak barrels stacked 3 stories high. The air here was different, less like vinegar and more like damp earth and gunpowder. 8 different tunnels branched off from this central hub, looking like the dark legs of a giant spider. "Stop," Julian whispered, lifting his hand. The pirates stood frozen in the center of the vault. The silence was heavy, broken only by the steady dripping of water falling from a stalactite into a dark puddle. Then, the sound they feared returned, the rhythmic splash of boots and the clanking of scabbards. The light of the soldiers' torches was reflecting off the wet walls of the tunnel they had just exited. "They're nearly here," Leo panted, leaning against a pillar. The heavy sack of silver was beginning to tear at the seams, leaking a few coins that clattered onto the stone floor. "We can't outrun them forever with this weight." Julian looked around the room. He saw the stacked barrels, ancient and heavy with spoiled wine and sediment. A plan began to form. "Leo, Silas, help me with these barrels. Maria, find the tunnel marked with the anchor symbol. That should lead toward the harbor." Maria scanned the archways. "Found it." "But Julian, we can't just leave you." "I'm right behind you," Julian said, gritting his teeth. "Just get the silver to the archway. Now." As the soldiers' voices became clear enough to understand their commands, Julian and the 2 men put their shoulders against the bottom row of a massive barrel stack. The wood was slick with mold, making it hard to get a grip. "On 3, Julian hissed. 1, 2, 3. With a collective groan of effort, they pushed. For a heartbeat. Nothing happened. Then, the rotted support beam beneath the stack snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The massive barrels began to shift. 1 fell, then 3, then a dozen, tumbling down in a chaotic, thundering avalanche of wood and sour liquid. They crashed directly in front of the tunnel entrance the soldiers were about to emerge from, creating a jagged wall of debris and spilling hundreds of gallons of dark, staining wine across the floor. "Move!" Julian shouted over the roar of the crashing barrels. The pirates scrambled toward the anchor-marked tunnel just as the first soldier reached the blockage. A muffled shout of frustration came from the other side of the debris. Julian didn't wait to see if they would climb over. He dove into the darkness of the new tunnel, his boots splashing through the spilled wine. This tunnel was different. It was newer, lined with brick instead of rough stone, and it sloped sharply downward. The smell of the sea grew stronger, a sharp, bracing scent of salt and rotting seaweed. "We're close to the water," Maria said, her voice echoing. "I can hear the tide hitting the foundations." They ran until the brickwork turned into mossy stone once more. At the end of the passage, a heavy iron grate blocked their path. Beyond the bars, Julian could see the dark, churning water of the harbor and the distant, flickering lights of the Pier 9 warehouses. "It's locked," Silas said, pulling at the rusted iron. Julian looked at the heavy lock, then back at the tunnel. The soldiers would be around the blockage any minute. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the bronze compass. It wasn't a key, but it was heavy. He gripped it like a hammer and began to strike the rusted bolt with all the desperation of a trapped man. The sound of the bronze compass striking the rusted iron bolt was sharp and rhythmic, a desperate heartbeat in the cold dampness of the tunnel. Each blow sent a jar of pain up Julian's arm, but he did not stop. Behind them, the sounds of the soldiers clearing the barrel wreckage grew louder, shouts of command, the scraping of wood, and the splashing of boots through the spilled wine. "It's not breaking," Leo hissed, glancing over his shoulder. The torch in Silas's hand was flickering low, casting long, frantic shadows against the mossy walls. "It has to." Julian grunted. He shifted his grip on the compass, feeling the ancient engravings bite into his palm. He took a deep breath, channeled all his frustration into one final, heavy swing, and brought the metal down. The rusted bolt, weakened by decades of salt air and Julian's relentless strikes, finally snapped. The heavy iron grate swung outward with a long, mournful groan that seemed to echo across the entire harbor. The pirates didn't wait. They scrambled through the opening, half falling onto a narrow wooden ledge that ran along the stone foundation of the pier. The transition was jarring. After the suffocating, sour air of the vinegar tunnels, the open harbor felt like a different world. The night air was freezing and sharp with the scent of brine and rotting fish. Above them, the massive wooden pilings of Pier 9 rose like the legs of a giant, and the dark water of the harbor churned and slapped against the stone just inches below their feet. "This way," Julian whispered, hugging the stone wall. "The warehouse is directly above us, but we have to find the service ladder." They moved in a single file, balancing on the slick, narrow ledge. Julian carried the heavy bag of silver, the weight pulling at his shoulder, while Leo and Silas hauled the remaining crates they had managed to save. Maria brought up the rear, her eyes scanning the dark water for any sign of a harbor patrol boat. The fog was still thick here, a swirling white blanket that muffled the sounds of the city. High above, they could hear the muffled shouts of the guards on the pier, their lanterns creating dim, yellow orbs in the mist. "There!" Silas pointed to a rusted iron ladder bolted to the side of the pier. It led upward into a dark square, a trapdoor in the floor of the warehouse. One by one, they climbed. The ladder was slippery with seaweed and slime, making every step a gamble. Julian reached the top first and pressed his shoulder against the trapdoor. It was heavy, but it wasn't locked. He pushed it open and crawled into the dark, cavernous space of the warehouse. The room smelled of dry grain and old burlap. It was silent, save for the distant sound of the tide. Julian helped Maria up, then Leo and Silas. They stood in the darkness, their chests heaving, surrounded by towering stacks of crates and barrels. "Are we safe?" Silas whispered, his voice trembling. "For the moment," Julian replied. He looked around the warehouse. This was the place Barnaby had mentioned. Somewhere in this maze of cargo was the entrance to the hidden cellar. Suddenly, the heavy main doors of the warehouse groaned. A thin line of light cut through the darkness as someone began to slide the bolt from the outside. The pirates froze, drawing their weapons as the door creaked open. A tall silhouette stood in the frame, backlit by the foggy street lamps. "You're late," a gravelly voice said. It wasn't the Admiral. It was a woman, her face hidden by a deep hood. "Barnaby said you were fast. The Navy is already circling the block." Julian kept his sword leveled at the hooded woman. Her presence was unexpected, and in the world of pirates, the unexpected usually meant a trap. The air in the warehouse was cold, and the smell of dry wool and grain felt heavy. Outside, the muffled rhythm of marching boots was getting louder. The Navy was systematic. They were checking every building on the pier. "Who are you?" Julian demanded, his voice a low growl. The woman reached up and pulled back her hood. She had sharp, clever eyes and a scar that ran across her cheek like a bolt of lightning. She didn't look afraid of Julian's blade. "Barnaby calls me the Crow," she said. "I handle the things he's too old and too slow to manage. If you want to keep that silver and your heads, you'll stop pointing steel at me and start moving." "How do we know you weren't sent by the Admiral?" Maria asked, her eyes narrowing. Ilara, known as the Crow, gave a short, dry laugh. "If I were with the Admiral, there would be 50 muskets pointed at your chest right now, not just one woman with a bad attitude. Now, follow me. The floorboards in the center of the room are a trap. The real safety is beneath the wool." She led them toward the back of the warehouse, where massive sacks of raw, unprocessed wool were stacked to the ceiling. The smell was earthy and thick. Ilara reached behind a support beam and pulled a hidden iron lever. With a soft, mechanical click, a section of the stone wall, disguised to look like part of the foundation, slid back just enough for a man to squeeze through. "Inside," she commanded. "Quickly. Leo, Silas, get those crates through first." As they pushed the last crate of silver into the hidden passage, a heavy blow struck the main warehouse doors. The wood groaned. The navy had arrived. Open in the name of the king. A voice shouted from the street. Julian was the last to enter the passage. He looked back and saw the light of torches leaking through the gaps in the warehouse doors. Ilara stepped inside and pulled the lever from the interior side. The stone wall slid back into place with a heavy, silent impact, just as the front doors of the warehouse were smashed open. Through the thick stone, Julian could hear the muffled shouts of soldiers and the sound of crates being overturned. They stood in a narrow, dry hallway lined with red bricks. Unlike the vinegar tunnels, this place was clean and well maintained. "This is Barnaby's private vault," Ilara explained, lighting a small candle. "The walls are 3 feet thick. Not even a cannon blast would be heard in here. You're safe for the night, but you can't stay forever. The Admiral has closed the port. No ship leaves until the Star of the Sea is found. We can't leave our ship in Oyster Bay," Julian said, his heart sinking. "If they find it, the crew left on board will be hanged." "They won't find it tonight," Ilara said, her eyes reflecting the candle flame. "The fog is your friend. But tomorrow, the sun will rise, and the Admiral will have his eyes on every inch of the coast. You need a plan to get back to the water, and you need it fast." Julian looked at the silver crates. They had worked so hard to get this far, but now they were trapped in a cage made of brick and gold. He looked at his compass. It was silent, but he knew the journey was far from over. The air inside the private vault was remarkably still, while the world above was a chaotic symphony of shouting soldiers and splintering wood. The space behind the stone wall felt like a tomb. It was a long, rectangular room filled with shelves of dusty ledgers and small iron lockboxes. In the center stood a heavy oak table, its surface scarred by years of secret deals. Julian sat on the edge of the table, his head in his hands. The adrenaline that had fueled their run through the vinegar tunnels was fading, replaced by a cold, sharp exhaustion. Leo and Silas had collapsed onto the floor, leaning against the crates of silver. Maria was the only one still moving, pacing the narrow length of the room like a caged panther. "We can't just sit here," Maria said, her voice tight. "The Admiral is smart. He'll realize the warehouse was empty too quickly. He'll start looking for false walls and hidden floors. We are in a box, Julian." Ilara, the crow, was leaning against the far wall, sharpening a small throwing knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic sound was the only noise in the room. "The vault is solid stone, girl. It was built during the Great Siege. Unless they bring a demolition team and enough black powder to level the pier, they aren't getting in. But your captain is right about one thing. The ship is the problem." "What do you know about the Navy's movements?" Julian asked, looking up. Ilara stopped sharpening her blade. "Vance has 3 frigates blocking the harbor mouth. He's also sent 2 cutters to patrol the northern coves. He's not just looking for you. He's looking for the Star of the Sea. He knows it's nearby. If he finds it at anchor in Oyster Bay, he won't capture it. He'll sink it to send a message." Julian felt a surge of protectiveness for his ship. The Star of the Sea wasn't just wood and canvas. It was the freedom of every person in this room. "We need a diversion," Silas suggested from the floor. He looked pale, his shirt stained with the wine from the Great Vault. "Something to draw the frigates away from the harbor mouth so we can slip out." "A diversion won't be enough," Julian said, his eyes narrowing as a plan began to take shape. "The Admiral wants the silver, but he wants me more. He wants to prove that he is the master of these waters. If we give him a Julian to chase, he'll follow it into the mouth of a volcano." "What are you thinking, Captain?" Leo asked, sitting up. "The cutter's ghost," Julian said softly. It's an old trick. We used it in the fog near the Reef of Bones years ago. We need a smaller boat, some lanterns, and enough black powder to make a show of it." Ilara raised an eyebrow, a flicker of respect in her eyes. "You want to fake a breakout from the other side of the island. While Vance is busy chasing a phantom ship in the mist, you sail the real one right through his front door." "It's risky," Maria warned. "If the fog lifts too early, we'll be sitting ducks. The fog in San Porto lasts until the noon sun." Julian replied firmly. "We have 6 hours. Ilara, can Barnaby get us a longboat and 3 barrels of powder?" The Crow stood up, sheathing her knife. "Barnaby can get you anything for the right price. But you'll have to move the silver again. I'm not leaving 3 crates of ancient treasure in my vault while you're out playing ghosts." Julian looked at his friends. They were tired and dirty, but the fire was back in their eyes. "We move at midnight. Let's get to work." Midnight arrived with the sound of the cathedral bell tolling 12 times, its deep, heavy strikes vibrating through the stone walls of the vault. For Julian, it was the starting pistol. The crew had spent the last few hours dividing the silver into smaller, reinforced canvas bags. They couldn't carry the heavy wooden crates anymore. They needed to be fast, and they needed to be silent. The Navy has doubled their patrols near the main gates, Ilara said, checking the street through a tiny brass periscope hidden in the warehouse wall. "But they've left the oiling docks to the south mostly ignored. It's too dirty and cramped for their big frigates. That's where Barnaby left the boat." Julian hoisted 2 bags of silver over his shoulders. "Let's move. Every minute we spend in this hole is a minute closer to the sun." Ilara led them through a different exit, a low, narrow crawl space behind a stack of ledgers. This path didn't lead back into the warehouse. It dropped straight into a forgotten drainage pipe that emptied out beneath the piers. The air was foul, a mixture of salt, oil, and ancient rot. But it kept them off the streets. They moved in a crouch, their boots splashing softly in the shallow, black water of the Soar. After 50 yards of claustrophobic crawling, they emerged into the space beneath the oiling docks. Massive wooden pilings, slick with black grease and barnacles, rose out of the water like the legs of a spider. The fog was even thicker here, a swirling white soup that tasted of coal smoke. Tied to a rotted piling was the boat Barnaby had promised. It was a miserable-looking longboat, its paint peeling and its wood grey with age. It looked like a discarded carcass, but to Julian, it was perfect. "Silas, Leo, get the powder barrels inside," Julian ordered. While Maria kept watch from the shadows of a piling, the men worked with feverish speed. They placed 3 barrels of black powder in the center of the longboat. Then, Silas began the ghost setup. He fixed several long wooden poles to the sides of the boat and hung lanterns from them, covered by thin, tattered cloth. From a distance in the fog, these flickering lights would look like the portholes and deck lights of a much larger ship. "We need a fuse," Julian said, looking at the powder. "Something long enough to give us time to get back to Oyster Bay." "I have a slow match," Silas replied, pulling a coil of treated rope from his coat. "I can set it to trigger the barrels in 20 minutes. That should give the ghost enough time to drift toward the harbor mouth with the outgoing tide." Suddenly, a bright beam of light cut through the fog above them. A Navy patrol boat was passing overhead, its lantern scanning the pilings. The pirates froze, pressing themselves against the oily wood. Julian held his breath as the light passed just inches from the longboat. The sound of oars splashing and soldiers talking drifted down to them. "Just another hour and I'm off duty," one soldier grumbled. "Don't get lazy," another replied. The admiral said he'd have the ears of anyone who lets that pirate slip by. The patrol moved on, their voices fading into the mist. Julian let out a long breath. That was too close. "Silas, set the match. We launch now." They pushed the ghost boat out into the current. The outgoing tide caught the light craft, pulling it slowly away from the docks and toward the open water where the Navy frigates waited. The muffled lanterns flickered, creating a haunting, shifting silhouette in the fog. To anyone on the Iron Whale, it would look like the Star of the Sea was making a desperate run for the horizon. "It's gone," Julian whispered, watching the lights disappear into the white wall. "Now, we run for Oyster Bay. We have 20 minutes before the world explodes." The sprint began the moment the ghost boat vanished into the white haze of the harbor. Every second felt like an hour, and every breath was a sharp, cold sting in Julian's lungs. They couldn't stay near the water. The Navy would soon be swarming the docks once the decoy was spotted. Julian led them toward the Devil's Staircase, a treacherous, narrow path carved directly into the limestone cliffs that skirted the western edge of the city. The stairs were nothing more than jagged ledges slick with sea spray and moss. To their left was a sheer drop of 50 feet into the churning, rocky surf. To their right was the cold, unyielding stone of the cliff face. Carrying the silver made the climb a nightmare. Julian could feel the canvas straps of the bags digging into his shoulders, the weight threatening to pull him off balance with every gust of wind. "Keep your centers low," Julian hissed back at the group. "Watch for the loose shale." Maria was moving with the agility of a cat, her eyes constantly darting between the path ahead and the city lights behind them. Leo was struggling the most. His massive frame wasn't built for mountain goat work, and the heavy crate he had refused to leave behind was a clumsy burden. Silas stayed close to him, offering a steadying hand whenever Leo's boots slipped on the wet stone. They were halfway up the cliff when a low, vibrating hum began to ripple through the air. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of the harbor coming alive. Julian stopped and looked back. Far out in the mist, he could see the flickering lanterns of the ghost boat. It had drifted perfectly into the center of the shipping channel. Through his telescope, Julian saw the Iron Whale and two other frigates beginning to turn their hulls. They had seen the lights of the escaping pirate ship. "They're taking the bait," Julian whispered. Seconds later, the night didn't just break, it shattered. A massive, orange-white flash bloomed in the heart of the fog. The 3 barrels of black powder Silas had rigged exploded with a roar that shook the very cliffs they were standing on. A pillar of fire shot upward, briefly illuminating the entire harbor. From their high vantage point, Julian saw the ghost boat disintegrate into a million flaming splinters. The reaction from the Navy was immediate. Signal rockets hissed into the sky, bursting in red stars to alert the rest of the fleet. The heavy thud of drums echoed across the water. The frigates began to fire their cannons into the smoke, thinking they were engaging a wounded enemy. "That's our cue," Julian shouted over the distant thunder of the guns. "Move. We have to reach the bay before the smoke clears." The explosion had done more than distract the admiral. It had created a brief window of pure chaos. Every soldier in San Porto was looking toward the harbor mouth. The pirates scrambled over the final ridge of the Devil's Staircase and began the descent into the hidden cove of Oyster Bay. As they reached the sandy shore, the familiar silhouette of the Star of the Sea emerged from the darkness. She was sitting low in the water, her sails already unfurled and ready to catch the wind. Silas let out a ragged cheer. "Boat ahoy!" Julian called out, his voice hoarse. A small rowboat quickly detached from the ship's side, manned by 2 of the crew who had stayed behind. They rowed with desperate strength, reaching the beach in minutes. "Captain!" "We heard the blast," one of the sailors cried as they began loading the silver bags into the boat. "We thought the Star was done for." "Not tonight," Julian said, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the fires were still burning. "But the Admiral won't be fooled for long. Get this silver on board. We're leaving this port behind forever." The wooden deck of the Star of the Sea had never felt so solid, so welcoming. As Julian's boots hit the planks, He felt a surge of energy that pushed through his exhaustion. Around him, the ship was a hive of controlled franticness. Sailors who had waited in the silence of Oyster Bay for hours were now moving with the speed of lightning. "Secure those bags in the captain's cabin," Julian barked, pointing to the silver. "Leo, Silas, get to the capstan. I want that anchor up before the smoke from the harbor settles." The silver was quickly hauled up in nets. The heavy canvas bags clinked and groaned, a reminder of the price they had nearly paid. Maria stood at the stern, her telescope pressed to her eye, watching the distant orange glow of the burning decoy. "The frigates are lowering their boats to inspect the wreckage," she reported. Her voice was steady but fast. "The admiral will know within minutes that there are no bodies and no treasure in that debris. He'll look for the nearest place a ship could have hidden. Then we have exactly those minutes to be gone." Julian replied. He ran to the helm, his hands gripping the familiar worn wood of the wheel. "Set the mainsail. Jib and topsails. I want every inch of canvas we have." The heavy iron anchor began to rise, the rhythmic mechanism sounding like a ticking clock. The ship groaned as the wind caught the sails, tilting the hull slightly to the port side. They began to glide out of the cove, the dark rocks of Oyster Bay slipping past like silent sentinels. Just as the Star of the Sea reached the mouth of the bay, a new light appeared. It wasn't the orange fire of the explosion or the yellow glow of the city. It was a sharp, focused blue light, a signal lantern from a navy cutter. It was the Vigilant, a fast, nimble scout ship that had been stationed just outside the bay's entrance. "They saw us," Silas yelled from the rigging. The Vigilant didn't fire its cannons immediately. Instead, it shot a flare into the sky, a bright white streak that illuminated the Star of the Sea for all to see. The secret was out. The admiral would now know exactly where his prize was hiding. "Ignore the cutter," Julian commanded, his eyes fixed on the open sea ahead. "They can't stop us alone, and they'll wait for the frigates to close the gap. We have to outrun them into the deeper currents." "Captain, the wind is shifting," Leo called out, his hands raw from the anchor rope. The wind, which had been a steady friend, was now gusting unpredictably. The ship bucked against the waves. Julian could see the Vigilant turning to follow them, its sails white and ghostly in the moonlight. Behind the cutter, the massive silhouettes of the admiral's frigates were beginning to move away from the burning wreck, their prows turning toward Oyster Bay. "We aren't just running anymore," Maria said, drawing her pistol and checking the flint. "We're racing the dawn." Julian nodded, his jaw set. He steered the ship into the rising swells of the open ocean. The Star of the Sea was fast, but she was wounded and heavy with treasure. The hunt had entered its final, most dangerous phase. They were no longer ghosts in the fog. They were targets in the light. The Vigilant was aptly named. As a navy cutter, it was designed for one purpose: to hunt. While the Star of the Sea was a sturdy vessel built for endurance and broad-reach sailing, the cutter was a greyhound. It sat low in the water, its single massive mast raked back to catch even the slightest breath of wind. As they left the shelter of the cliffs, the cutter began to shave the distance between them with terrifying efficiency. "She's gaining, Captain," Silas shouted from the main deck. He was looking through his glass, his knuckles white. "She's not even bothering with her bow chasers yet. She's trying to get alongside to grapple us." Julian looked back. The Vigilant was slicing through the swells, its prow throwing up white curtains of spray that sparkled in the moonlight. Behind it, far on the horizon, the lights of the admiral's frigates were spreading out like a net. If the cutter could slow them down for even half an hour, the Iron Whale would be upon them with its 64 cannons, and the story of Julian's crew would end in splinters and salt. "We're too heavy," Maria said, her voice tight. She looked at the cabin where the silver was stored. "The treasure is pulling us deep into the water. We're losing half a knot because of the weight." "I'm not throwing the silver back into the sea, Maria," Julian replied, his jaw set. He looked at the waves, then at the dark line of the black shoals to the north. It was a graveyard of ships, a place where jagged rocks sat just inches beneath the surface, hidden by the churning foam. "If we can't outrun her on the open water, we'll outmaneuver her in the teeth." "The shoals," Leo gasped, overhearing the command. "Captain, one wrong move and we'll rip the keel right off the ship. The Vigilant has a shallower draft than we do, but her captain won't know these waters like I do," Julian said. "Silas, man the stern chasers. Don't aim for the hull. I want her rigging. If we can snap even one of her stays, she'll lose her balance." The Star of the Sea began to turn, heading away from the safety of the deep ocean and toward the whitewater roar of the shoals. The crew of the Vigilant saw the move and adjusted their sails. They were confident. They had the speed, and they had the backing of the King's Navy. The first shot from the cutter's bow chaser echoed across the water. The iron ball skipped across the surface of a wave and slammed into the Star's stern, sending a shower of oak splinters into the air. The ship shuddered, but she held her course. "Fire!" Julian roared. Silas pulled the lanyard on the stern cannon. A cloud of thick, grey smoke billowed out, and a chain shot, two iron balls connected by a heavy chain, whirled through the air. It was a desperate shot, meant to tangle and tear. It missed the cutter's mast but shredded a large section of her jib sail. The Vigilant faltered for a moment, its nose dipping as the loss of sail tension affected its speed. But it wasn't enough. The cutter recovered, its crew quickly clearing the wreckage. "We're hitting the breakers," Maria warned, pointing ahead. The sound of the ocean changed from a deep thrum to a violent, crashing hiss. White foam exploded all around them as the Star of the Sea entered the black shoals. Julian gripped the wheel, feeling the ship vibrate as the current fought to pull them onto the rocks. The chase had moved from a race to a dance of death. The roar of the black shoals was deafening, a chaotic symphony of crashing waves and the grinding of hidden stone. Spray flew over the deck of the Star of the Sea in freezing sheets, drenching the crew and making the wood as slippery as ice. To any other captain, this was a graveyard. To Julian, it was a map written in foam. "I see the V in the water," Julian screamed over the wind. He was referring to a specific pattern of waves that signaled a narrow, deep water channel hidden between two jagged ridges of rock known as the Needle's Eye. "Maria, get to the bow. I need your eyes on the color of the water. If it turns pale green, we're too shallow." The Star of the Sea plunged into a trough between two massive swells. For a terrifying heartbeat, the keel felt as if it was scraping the very belly of the ocean. Then, the ship rose again, water pouring from its scuppers. Behind them, the Vigilant was still coming, its captain clearly fueled by the prospect of the reward. The cutter was lighter and sat higher in the water, which gave its crew the false confidence that they could follow Julian anywhere. "They're not slowing down," Silas yelled, clinging to a stay. "They think they can shadow us through the gap." "Let them try." Julian gritted his teeth, his muscles bulging as he fought the wheel. The current here was like a living thing, a giant hand trying to shove the ship into the black, barnacle-encrusted teeth of the reefs. Julian waited until the last possible second, watching the Vigilant through the spray. He saw the cutter's prow lift as it prepared to follow them into the narrowest part of the Needle's Eye. "Now!" "Hard to starboard," Julian roared. He spun the wheel with everything he had. The Star of the Sea groaned, its heavy hull leaning dangerously as it pivoted. Julian wasn't going through the center of the gap. He was aiming for a tiny, secondary channel that looked like certain death. He knew that beneath the surface, a shelf of rock blocked the center of the main gap, even though it looked clear from above. The Vigilant, traveling at full speed to maintain its pursuit, couldn't react in time. Its captain, seeing Julian veer off, assumed the pirate had lost control and steered his own ship straight through the clear center of the Needle's eye. A sound like 1,000 glass windows shattering filled the air. The Vigilant didn't just stop. It disintegrated. The hidden rock shelf caught the cutter's keel at nearly 12 knots. The wooden hull peeled open like an orange. The mast snapped forward, its rigging entangling the deck as the sea rushed in. Within seconds, the proud Navy scout was a broken wreck, pinned against the rocks as the waves began to dismantle it. "They're down!" Leo shouted, his voice a mix of horror and relief. Julian didn't celebrate. He watched the wreckage slide away as the Star of the Sea emerged into the calmer, deeper water on the far side of the shoals. He looked back and saw the survivors of the Vigilant scrambling onto the rocks. They were safe from drowning, but their ship was gone. "We're clear of the cutter," Maria said, her face pale as she watched the Vigilant sink. "But look at the horizon, Julian." The white flare the cutter had fired earlier had done its job. The Iron Whale was no longer a distant speck. The Admiral's flagship was now visible to the naked eye, its massive sails catching the morning's first light. It was heading straight for the exit of the Black Shoals. The Greyhound was dead, but the Wolf was finally here. The horizon didn't just brighten, it bled. A deep, bruised orange spilled across the eastern sky, illuminating the skeletal remains of the Vigilant behind them and the terrifying reality in front of them. The Iron Whale was no longer a shadow. In the morning light, it was a mountain of oak and iron, its 3 massive masts draped in acres of white canvas that seemed to swallow the wind. "She's beautiful," Silas whispered, though there was no admiration in his voice, only a cold, hollow fear. "In a way that a shark is beautiful." The Iron Whale was a first-rate ship of the line. It carried 64 cannons, each one capable of turning the Star of the Sea into floating toothpicks with a single broadside. As the sun climbed higher, Julian saw the sun glinting off the polished brass of the Admiral's personal cabin windows. They were close enough now to see the sailors on the flagship's deck moving like a colony of ants. "He's not firing yet," Maria observed, her telescope fixed on the enemy. "He wants us intact. He wants the silver, and he wants you in chains on the deck of his ship for the return to San Porto." "He'll have a long wait," Julian said. He looked at his own ship. The Star of the Sea was leaning slightly to the starboard side. The stress of the Black Shoals had opened a small seam in the hull, and while the pumps were keeping up, the ship felt heavy. The silver in the hold wasn't helping. Suddenly, a white puff of smoke blossomed from the Iron Whale's bow. A second later, the roar of the gun reached them, followed by the terrifying iron ball passing directly over their mainmast. It splashed into the water ahead of them, a pillar of white brine marking the Admiral's range. "That was a warning," Julian said. "The next one will be for the rudder." "Captain, we can't outrun her in this light," Leo said, his voice trembling. "The wind is freshening, and she has twice the sail area we do. She'll be on our stern before the sun is a hand's breadth high." Julian looked to the north. The sky there was different, not orange or blue, but a flat, ominous grey. A squall line was moving in, a sudden, violent sea storm that often haunted these latitudes. To most sailors, it was a thing to be avoided. To Julian, it was a sanctuary. "We're not going to outrun her," Julian declared. "We're going to lead her into the grey shroud." The plan: head directly into the heart of the storm. The risk: the Star of the Sea is already damaged. The high winds could snap her masts. The goal: use the chaos of the storm to lose the Iron Whale, which is too large to maneuver safely in high-speed winds and low visibility. "If we go in there, we might not come out," Silas warned. "If we stay out here, we definitely won't," Julian countered. He turned the wheel, pointing the prow of the ship toward the wall of dark clouds. "All hands. Triple reef the sails. Lash everything down. We're going for a ride." The iron whale fired again. This time, the shot was no warning. The heavy ball slammed into the sea just yards from their hull, the vibration rattling the teeth of every man on deck. The hunt had turned into a siege, and the only escape was through the eye of the storm. The transition from the golden morning to the grey shroud was like slamming a door on the sun. One moment, the star of the sea was bathed in orange light. The next, it was swallowed by a wall of bruised purple and charcoal grey. The temperature plummeted, and the air turned thick with the smell of ozone and wet stone. "The wind is screaming," Silas yelled, his voice barely audible over the sudden whistling in the rigging. "Captain, the barometer is dropping like a stone. This isn't a squall, it's a monster." Julian ignored the cold rain that began to sting his face like needles. He kept his eyes fixed on the iron whale. The Admiral's ship was refusing to turn away. Vance had sensed his prey was cornered and was willing to risk his magnificent flagship to finish the hunt. The massive warship crested a 10-foot swell, its bow crashing down with enough force to send a mountain of spray over its own forecastle. "He's crazy," Maria muttered, wiping salt from her eyes as she clung to the railing near Julian. "He's going to bring that giant beast into these winds. He'll lose his masts. He thinks his iron can hold back the sea." Julian replied, his voice grim. "Let him learn the truth." Suddenly, the iron whale let out a roar that rivaled the thunder. A full broadside. The Admiral had grown tired of warnings. 24 cannons fired at once, the orange flashes briefly illuminating the dark storm wall like hellfire. The ocean around the Star of the Sea erupted. Massive geysers of water shot into the air as the iron balls missed their hull by mere yards. But one shot found its mark. A heavy ball slammed into the Star's upper deck, shattering a spare rowboat and sending jagged wooden splinters flying like shrapnel. Leo cried out, ducking as a piece of timber whistled past his ear. "Don't look back!" Julian roared, his knuckles white on the wheel. "Everyone below deck except the mast men. Secure the silver. If those bags break now, the weight shift will capsize us." The first real wave of the storm hit them then. It wasn't a wave so much as a wall of water 30 feet high. The Star of the Sea rose up, and up until her bowsprit was pointing at the churning clouds. For a second, the ship hung in the air, weightless. Then, she plummeted. The hull groaned in a way that made Julian's heart ache, a deep, wooden scream of overstressed oak. They plunged into the darkness of the shroud. Visibility vanished instantly. The iron whale was gone, hidden by a curtain of torrential rain so thick Julian couldn't see the front of his own ship. "I can't see the compass glow," Silas shouted from the mainmast. "I don't need the compass." Julian yelled back, "I can feel the current. Stay on the ropes. If you go overboard, the sea is your only grave." Inside the storm, the world became a chaotic nightmare of noise and motion. The wind didn't just blow, it hammered. But Julian felt a strange sense of relief. In this chaos, the Admiral's 64 cannons were useless. You cannot aim at what you cannot see, and you cannot fire in a deluge that douses every fuse. They were alone with the storm now. The hunt had stopped, replaced by a raw struggle for survival against the primary forces of the Earth. The Star of the Sea was no longer sailing. It was being thrown. Inside the heart of the grey shroud, the ocean had lost all sense of rhythm. Waves slammed into the hull from 3 different directions at once, creating a cross-sea that threatened to twist the ship's frame until the planks popped. Julian stood at the helm, his legs braced so wide they ached, his hands locked onto the wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him in the world of the living. "Captain!" "The hold!" Leo screamed, emerging from the hatchway. He was drenched to the bone, his face twisted in a mask of pure terror. "The silver! The lashings have snapped." Julian's heart skipped a beat. In a storm this violent, a shifting cargo was more dangerous than a dozen cannons. Thousands of pounds of silver and gems were now a loose, sliding mountain of metal. Every time the ship tilted to the port side, the treasure would slam into the ribs of the hull. If it hit hard enough, it would punch a hole straight through to the ocean. "Silas! Take the wheel!" Julian roared. "I can't hold her alone, Julian!" Silas yelled back, his eyes wide as a 40-foot wave loomed over the stern. "You have to! Maria, help him!" Julian didn't wait for an answer. He threw himself toward the hatch and slid down the ladder into the darkness of the lower deck. The scene below was a nightmare. The lanterns had all been extinguished, leaving the hold in a flickering, ghostly twilight. The heavy canvas bags of silver were sliding across the wet floorboards with a sound like grinding bones. Leo was already there, trying to wedge a spare mast piece against the sliding mass, but the weight was too much. "Get the nets!" Julian shouted, dodging a bag that skidded past his feet like a cannonball. "We have to pin it against the center mast. If it hits the hull again, we're finished." They fought the treasure in the dark. It was a strange, ironic battle. The very wealth they had risked their lives for was now trying to kill them. Julian grabbed a coil of heavy rope and threw himself onto the pile. The ship suddenly heeled over 45 degrees. The silver surged forward. Julian felt a sharp pain in his ribs as he was pinned between the treasure and the wood, the breath leaving his lungs in a ragged gasp. "Julian!" Leo lunged forward, using his massive strength to heave a bag aside just enough for Julian to roll free. Together, with muscles screaming, they managed to throw a heavy cargo net over the pile and bolt it to the iron rings in the floor. They tightened the lines until the silver was a motionless, bulging mound in the center of the ship. Just as Julian let out a breath of relief, a sound cut through the roar of the storm that didn't belong to the wind. It was the deep, mournful tolling of a bell. "The Admiral!" Julian whispered, his blood turning to ice. He scrambled back up to the deck. Through the blinding sheets of rain, a massive shadow appeared to their starboard side. It was a ghost in the mist. The Iron Whale. It was less than 50 yards away, its towering masts swaying like the arms of a giant. The two ships were on a collision course in the middle of a blind hurricane. The Admiral wasn't firing. He was trying to ram them. The tolling of the Iron Whale's bell was a funeral march played by the wind. Through the horizontal curtains of rain, the massive warship looked less like a vessel and more like a floating fortress of dark, wet oak. Its prow, reinforced with iron plates that gave the ship its name, rose high above the star of the sea, ready to come down like a guillotine. "He's not going to fire!" Maria screamed, her hands white-knuckled on the railing. "He's going to crush us under the hull." "Silas! Drop the main jib!" Julian roared, leaping back to the helm. "Leo, get the portside sweeps out. We need a pivot, now." The maneuver was madness. Dropping sail in the middle of a hurricane usually meant an immediate capsize, but Julian needed to kill their forward momentum so the Iron Whale would overreach. If they stayed on their current course, they would be struck broadside and snapped in two. As the Iron Whale bore down on them, Julian saw a figure standing on its high quarterdeck. It was Admiral Vance. Even in the chaos of the storm, the man stood perfectly still, his hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. He wasn't looking for a battle of cannons. He was looking for an execution. "Now!" Julian screamed. The Star of the Sea bucked as the sails were released. Without the forward tension, the ship was at the mercy of the waves. A massive swell caught their stern, lifting the pirate ship and throwing it sideways. It was a terrifying, stomach-churning slide. The Iron Whale roared past. The distance between the two ships was so small that Julian could hear the creaking of the Admiral's timber over the storm. The massive iron prow missed their stern by less than 3 feet, the displacement of water from the larger ship creating a localized whirlpool that threatened to suck the Star into the warship's wake. "Brace for the wash!" Silas yelled. The wake of the 64-gun ship hit them like a physical blow. The Star of the Sea tilted so far to the starboard side that the ends of her yardarms dipped into the churning sea. For 5 long seconds, the ship hung on the edge of turning turtle. Water flooded the deck, chest high, sweeping away spare ropes and the shattered remains of the rowboat. Then, slowly, miraculously, the ship righted herself. Julian gasped for air, spitting out salt water. He looked through the spray and saw the iron whale disappearing back into the grey shroud. Because of its massive size and the momentum of its full sails, the warship couldn't turn quickly. It was being carried away by the very wind it had tried to master. "We missed them," Leo panted, pulling himself up from the deck. "We're alive. For now," Julian said, his eyes scanning the darkness. "But the Admiral won't stop. He'll wear his ship around and come back. We need to find the false channel before he finds us." The Star of the Sea was battered, her railing gone and her mainmast groaning, but she was still afloat. The game of cat and mouse had become a game of ghosts in the dark. The false channel was a sailor's myth, a ghost story told in the taverns of San Porto to frighten cabin boys. It was said to be a gap in the northern cliffs that appeared to lead to the open sea but actually funneled ships into a U-turn of jagged granite and whirlpools. But Julian knew the secret. The channel wasn't a dead end. It was a needle's eye that led to the hidden lagoon, a place where the water was as still as glass, protected by the mountain's heights. "Julian, the ship can't take much more of this," Maria cried, pointing to the mainmast. A fresh crack had appeared in the wood, widening every time the wind caught the remains of the mainsail. The Star of the Sea was weeping at every seam. The pumps were working at full capacity, but the water in the lower hold was already ankle-deep. The weight of the silver was no longer just a burden. It was a lead weight pulling them toward the bottom of the ocean. There, between the 2 dark towers, Julian pointed. Through the sheets of rain, 2 massive basalt pillars rose out of the surf like the legs of a fallen colossus. They were the twin sisters, the guardians of the false channel. To an outsider, the space between them looked like a wall of white foam and certain death. "Hard to port," Julian ordered, throwing his weight against the wheel. As the Star of the Sea began her turn, the grey shroud briefly parted. For a fleeting second, the moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the sea behind them. The iron whale was there, closer than ever. Admiral Vance had anticipated Julian's move. The warship was no longer trying to ram. It was positioning itself for a final, devastating broadside. He's opening his gun ports. Silas screamed from the middeck. Julian didn't look back. Brace. Brace for the surge. The pirate ship hit the mouth of the channel. The water here was a chaotic mess of colliding currents. The Star was lifted by a rogue wave and propelled forward with terrifying speed. At that exact moment, the iron whale fired. The roar of 60 cannons was louder than the thunder. The sea behind the Star of the Sea erupted in a line of geysers as the heavy iron balls fell short, swallowed by the turbulent entrance of the channel. One ball, however, clipped the very top of the Star's mizzenmast, sending the rigging crashing down in a tangle of rope and canvas. "We're through! We're through!" Leo yelled, though he was pinned under a fallen spar. The transition was instantaneous. As they passed between the twin sisters, the howling wind of the hurricane was cut off by the massive stone walls of the cliffs. The violent tossing of the ship stopped, replaced by a smooth, eerie glide. The rain was still falling, but the sea was suddenly, unnervingly quiet. They were in the false channel. The walls of the canyon rose hundreds of feet on either side, so close that Julian could have thrown a stone and hit the mossy rock. The sound of the storm was now a distant, muffled roar above them. "Is he following?" Julian whispered, his voice cracking. They all looked back at the entrance. The iron whale appeared in the gap, its massive bowsprit poking between the twin sisters. But the Admiral was no fool. He saw the narrowness of the canyon and the way the currents swirled. He knew his 64-gun fortress was too wide, too deep, and too heavy to enter without being shredded by the underwater spurs. The warship slowed, its sails shivering as it backed off. For a long minute, the two enemies stared at each other, the trapped pirate and the frustrated hunter. Then, the iron whale turned away, disappearing back into the darkness of the shroud to wait for the storm to break. "We're safe," Maria said, her voice trembling as she collapsed against the mast. "No," Julian said, looking at the rising water in the hold. "We're just hidden. Now we have to save the ship before she sinks under the weight of her own treasure." The silence of the false channel was heavier than the roar of the storm. Inside the canyon, the air was stagnant and smelled of ancient moss and wet limestone. The Star of the Sea glided forward, her broken rigging trailing in the water like the limbs of a wounded bird. The only sound was the rhythmic of the manual pumps and the mournful creak of the damaged hull. "Captain, the water is rising faster," Silas reported, his face grimed with soot and salt. The pressure from the storm opened the seams near the stern post. "If we don't ground her soon, the silver won't be in the hold. It'll be part of the seabed." Julian scanned the dark canyon walls. The passage narrowed until the yardarms nearly brushed the stone, then suddenly, it opened into a breathtaking sight: the hidden lagoon. It was a perfect circle of turquoise water, protected by high, curving cliffs that blocked the wind entirely. A small, white sand beach lay at the far end, silvered by the moonlight that managed to pierce through the thinning clouds above. "There!" Julian pointed to the sandy spit. "We're going to beach her. Leo, get the forward anchors ready to drop the moment the keel touches. We need to hold her steady so she doesn't slide back into the deep water when the tide turns." The Star of the Sea groaned as her prow touched the soft sand. With a long, grinding shiver, the ship came to a rest. She tilted sharply to the port side, the masts leaning toward the trees that lined the shore. "Everyone off," Julian commanded. "Except the repair crew. Maria, take the silver bags to the high ground. If the Admiral finds a way in here, I don't want the treasure trapped on a sinking ship." The next few hours were a blur of grueling labor. While the storm continued to howl outside the canyon walls, the pirates worked in the eerie calm of the lagoon. They used heavy ropes to tie the ship to the massive tropical trees on the shore, preventing her from slipping back into the water. Silas and the carpenters went below, using a mixture of raw wool, hot tar, and wooden plugs to seal the leaking seams. Julian stood on the beach, his boots sinking into the wet sand. He watched his crew work. They were exhausted, their clothes in rags, but they moved with a purpose that no Navy discipline could ever instill. "The storm is breaking," Maria said, walking up to him. She carried 2 pistols and a bag of dry powder. She looked toward the narrow entrance of the channel. "The wind is dying down. By dawn, the sea will be flat, and the Admiral will be sitting right outside that gap, waiting for us to come out." "I know," Julian replied. He looked at the bronze compass in his hand. It was silent, its needle pointing toward the stone wall of the lagoon. "We can't go back out the way we came in. The iron whale would pick us off like a sitting duck." "Then we're trapped," she said simply. "Not necessarily," Julian said, his eyes following the compass needle. He looked at the back of the lagoon, where a thick curtain of vines draped over the cliff face. He noticed something. The water there was rippling, even though there was no wind. "There's a current moving under that rock. A subterranean passage." "A way out?" Maria asked, hope flickering in her eyes. "Or a very beautiful grave?" Julian said. "But we have one chapter left in this story, and I don't intend for it to end in a cage." Dawn arrived not with a roar, but with a golden hush. The storm had spent its fury, leaving the hidden lagoon as smooth as a mirror. The Star of the Sea sat on the sand, her hull patched with dark tar and her rigging reorganized. She was scarred, leaning, and weary, but she was still a ship of the line in the eyes of her crew. "The tide is coming in, Captain," Silas said, standing on the deck. "In an hour, the water will be deep enough to float her off the sand. But the Admiral, he hasn't moved. I can see his topmasts through the gap. He's anchored right in the center of the false channel's exit." Julian looked at the curtain of vines at the back of the lagoon. The current he had spotted earlier was stronger now, pulling the floating debris toward the dark opening in the cliff. "We aren't going out the front door, Silas. We're going through the mountain." The crew worked with a quiet, desperate intensity. They didn't use the sails. The wind couldn't reach them inside the cave. Instead, they used the longboats to warp the ship, rowing ahead, dropping small anchors, and then pulling the Star of the Sea forward with the capstan. It was slow, back-breaking work. As the ship entered the subterranean passage, the masts barely cleared the stalactites hanging from the ceiling. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. For a long, terrifying hour, they moved through the darkness, the only light coming from a few lanterns and the bioluminescent moss on the walls. The sound of the ship's hull echoing in the cavern was a ghostly reminder of how close they were to the heart of the island. Suddenly, a pinpoint of white light appeared ahead. It grew larger and brighter until, with a final surge of the current, the Star of the Sea shot out of the mountain. They emerged on the northern side of the island, miles away from the false channel. The open ocean stretched before them, vast and blue, untroubled by any navy sails. Far to the west, behind the high peaks of the island, the iron whale remained at its station, guarding an empty exit. Admiral Vance was waiting for a ghost that would never appear. "We did it," Maria whispered, standing at Julian's side. The sun caught the silver coins in the bags on the deck, making them glow like embers. "We're free." Julian took the helm. He felt the familiar pull of the deep water, the promise of 1,000 miles of unexplored horizon. He looked at Leo, who was already dreaming of his farm, at Silas, who was checking the stars, and at Sam, who was no longer a frightened boy, but a sailor of the Sun's Island. "Where to, Captain?" Silas asked, a wide grin on his face. Julian pulled the bronze compass from his pocket. He didn't need it to tell him where to go, but he looked at it one last time before dropping it into the deep, blue water. He didn't need ancient magic anymore. He had his ship, his crew, and a future they had written for themselves. "Southwest," Julian commanded, his voice steady and full of joy. "Toward the Spice Islands. I hear the sunsets there are made of real gold, and the only admirals are the seagulls." The Star of the Sea caught the morning breeze, her white sails blossoming like a flower. She cut through the waves, leaving the island of the sun and the shadows of the past far behind. The greatest treasure wasn't the silver in the hold. It was the endless blue road ahead.